Hello, my name is Gail Cartmail. I'm an Assistant General Secretary of Unite and this year's TUC President. I have great pleasure in opening the TUC's 153rd Congress. Usually we'd have hundreds of delegates in the hall representing working people in every conceivable industry and profession from every part of the UK. But to keep safe, we have chosen to host Congress online this year. So our delegates today join us online at their homes or in their offices or workplaces, and I warmly welcome each and every delegate to this year's event and look forward to your contributions. One of the benefits of running Congress online is that we can also extend the invitation to thousands of working people across the country who are watching this via our live stream. Welcome to each and every one of you as well. And over the next 3 days, we'll talk about the big issues that matter to working people, their families and our communities. We'll talk about the ongoing impact of coronavirus on working lives, how we build the recovery we want to see after the pandemic, and express our thanks to our key workers for their hard work and dedication. We'll discuss the work of our anti-racism task force and how we tackle ongoing structural racism in our society and in our workplaces. And we'll hear from union leaders, frontline workers, and our international trade union sisters. Tomorrow, we'll hear from the TUC's General Secretary, Frances O'Grady, and on Tuesday, we will welcome Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition. Before I call Linda McCulloch, Chair of the General Purposes Committee, to report to us on the progress of business, I'll quickly share some housekeeping information. Over the next 3 days, we will take debates on the motions submitted by our unions. Due to this year's Congress being online and taken over a reduced time, we will not be able to take a debate on each motion. We have prioritised motions that have been composited, our statutory conference motions and General Council statements. For all other motions, I will be moving them formally. All the motions can be found in your agenda or on the TUC website. We'll take a series of delegates in all our debates. All those speaking should have received a Zoom link in advance. If you are scheduled to speak and have not received this Zoom link and are watching on the Congress Live site, please contact your union delegation leader or Kevin Rowan in the GP office as soon as possible, and we'll try and get you the correct link. As usual, most of our business and policy decisions will be achieved by consensus. If we need to take a formal vote on any motions, amendments or statements, Civica will conduct an electronic ballot on our behalf. This will replace card votes with a system of electronic voting accessed via an email sent to each affiliate and weighted according to membership in the usual way. During the course of Congress, I'm pleased I'll be joined over the 3 days on the platform by former TUC presidents and members of our General Council, Sue Ferns, Mary Bousted, Liz Snape and Gloria Mills, who will be taking on the Vice President role as unfortunately Jed Nichols, our Vice President, cannot join us. Sue is with us today alongside our General Secretary, Frances O'Grady, and the TUC's Deputy General Secretary, Paul Novak. Congress, I now call upon Linda McCulloch, Chair of the General Purposes Committee, to report to us on the progress of business and other Congress arrangements.
Thank you, Gail. Good afternoon, Congress. The General Purpose Committee has approved 18 composite motions. Composite motions 1 to 18 are included in section 3 of the GPC report and composite motions booklet that you have all received. On behalf of the GPC, I would like to thank all those unions who have cooperated and worked together to reach agreement on composite motions. Congress, the General Council has agreed 2 statements. After the pandemic, a trade union action plan for a just and resilient future, and taking forward the work of the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force. Can I also remind delegates that the mover of each motion may speak for up to 5 minutes and all other speakers for up to 3 minutes. Thank you for your cooperation in this matter. I will report further to you on progress of business and other GPC decisions when necessary throughout Congress. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Linda. The GPC's report is agreed. Colleagues, we now come to the obituary section, when we remember our trade union colleagues who have died over the past year. You can read more about the contribution many of these colleagues made to the trade union movement in the General Council report on page 74 and in the video available on the TUC website. Since the report was published, we have learnt about the sad death of Barry Francis, former TUC regional manager on union learning in our southern and eastern region. Barry was also president of SOGAT Central London branch and active in the graphical paper and media union, which later merged to become part of my union, Unite. We also heard of the sad passing of Rich Trumper, the president of our sister organisation in the US, the AFL-CIO. Rich was a fearless champion for working people, an anti-racist to his core, and a true global Labour leader. And he was a great friend of the TUC. We have also lost other good colleagues and friends during the year, including Gareth Young, Deputy General Secretary of the NASUWT, and Joe Mann, MBE, former Deputy General Secretary at Community. In asking you to remember all our former colleagues, I also ask you to remember other trade union colleagues who have died in the past year. I'm sure our thoughts are also with all those who have suffered loss through war, acts of terrorism, natural disasters, most recently Hurricane Ida and Tropical Storm Grace, which claimed the lives of so many in the US and Haiti, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic over the past year. This Congress is the 20th anniversary of 9/11, when nearly 3,000 people, including firefighters and emergency services staff, lost their lives. And we remember how our members, British firefighters and emergency workers, went over to help our American brothers and sisters in their hour of need. Now, after 2 decades of military occupation, the Afghan people face a humanitarian crisis. We stand by our sisters and brothers seeking to defend their rights and those seeking asylum. We're reminded once again that there has never been a more important time for trade unions to stand up for working people, for peace and for justice all over the globe. Thank you. I'd now like to open our first debate on Section 1 of the General Council report, the economy, the section on energy and the environment. Beforehand, I'd like to remind everybody contributing to our discussions about the statement of conduct that was circulated to all speakers in advance. I mean, it should go without saying that we expect all attendees to behave in a courteous and respectful manner. And let's be kind to one another and appreciate in advance there may be some glitches. Probably they'll be my mistakes, but never mind. We will be kind to one another and overcome them. I ask that everyone respects their speaking time. 5 minutes for those moving a motion and 3 minutes for seconding a motion and all other speakers. And please don't feel obliged to use up all your time. So, without further ado, I call paragraph 2.8 of the General Council report and composite motion 2, the climate emergency, defending jobs and a just transition. The General Council support the composite motion, and I will call the Deputy General Secretary during the debate to explain the position. The motion will be moved by Kevin Buchanan from the GMB, and then seconded by Neil Hope Collins from Prospect. Kevin, you're very welcome.
President Congress, Kevin Buchanan, moving the composite on behalf of GMB. Congress, there cannot be a more important time to hold this debate. The effects of man-made global warming can be seen all around us. As the motion states, the need to reduce emissions while remaining true to our labour values is the greatest challenge of our times. We must be equal to it. And Congress union members are making a difference. From the shop floor up, we are securing the future of our industries and reducing emissions. Along with our sister unions, I am proud that the GMB is a signatory to the Devonport Environmental Sustainability Agreement, to the Offshore Energy Services Agreement, and that our reps are working day and night to secure the option of redeployment as the UK's last coal-fired plants close. When we negotiate policies that lower carbon emissions, we know that we are advocating the best solutions for our industries, because those solutions have been developed by the members, the people who know their jobs better than anyone. The choice before us is not whether we decarbonise, but how. We cannot abandon those decisions to the market or to politicians who do not have our members' interests at heart. And we must be honest when environmental policies are failing working people. There are more orders for renewable components than ever, but they're being placed offshore to the lowest bidder. They're often produced by sweated labour and even forced labour. They're shipped to the UK at enormous carbon cost while our fabrication yards lie empty. The financial costs of this are loaded onto customers' bills, a regressive policy that hits the poorest hardest. And according to the government's own figures, while subsidies rise each year, the number of green jobs in the UK is actually falling. Congress, this is not environmentalism. It's not a workers' agenda. It's unbridled exploitation read in tooth and claw. We need a different approach. That is why this composite puts forward a trade union agenda for decarbonisation. It's an agenda that makes sure that new industries are organised and that we make the components they need right here in the UK. An agenda that sets out an enhanced role for reps with new legal protection. It will help us to move with the times by making sure that the international debates on an environmental trade policy are not neglected in our Parliament and beyond. In Congress, crucially, it sets out the need for consultation with workers, for transitions to be agreed, not imposed. This is particularly important to us as an energy union. We know that when industries close down, workers are always left behind, and our members' livelihoods are at stake. We were forged in the heat of Beckton gasworks more than 130 years ago, and we are fighting for our members' future, for a decarbonised gas network based on lower zero carbon gases with hydrogen-ready boilers made right here in the UK. But that future needs a clear commitment from politicians. And while uncertainty grows, jobs are under threat and pay and terms and conditions are all under attack. And Congress, the future of our nuclear industry, our unionised nuclear industry is in peril as most stations move to decommissioning in the next decade. An industry that employs 17,000 skilled workers and 60,000 more in the supply chain. Every day, union members work to deliver clean, affordable and safe power. We need the steady supply that nuclear provides to reach our decarbonisation targets. There can be no net zero without new nuclear. And either we build the plants in the UK with decently paid, organised labour, investing in skills and the next generation, or we import that energy from abroad. Our members need an urgent decision on Sizewell C and other sites, and I ask for your support. Energy workers have kept the production lines moving and our homes warm. Let us send a message out beyond this Congress that they cannot be left in the cold now. Congress, support our members' futures. Please support the composite. I move.
Can I call the seconder, please? Neil Hope Collins of Prospect.
Thank you, President. Congress, Neil Hope Collins, Prospect, seconding Composite 2. Prospect represents members working in every aspect of the climate emergency, the scientists and environmentalists providing the evidence of the scale and pace of the threat we're facing on our world, and those working in energy in all its forms, carbon-based, nuclear and renewables. The climate emergency affects all of us in our day-to-day lives, which is why the TUC must have a voice on this subject. But our members working in energy face an additional direct impact on their working lives and their futures. Successive governments have taken a short-term approach to climate and energy, and this approach has inhibited progress towards net zero. We need a coherent decarbonisation plan that tackles the whole system: energy consumption, distribution, and generation. As a society, we have to change our approach to energy, how much we consume. We must act collectively in our workplaces through empowered environmental reps to achieve significant results. We need systems that can get power to where it is needed. We need smarter, more flexible grids. The electricity network has suffered from decades of underinvestment. It is in desperate need of maintenance and modernising if it is to do what is needed. It's not sexy or photogenic, but this work is essential if we are to achieve net zero carbon. And yes, we do need to change the way we generate electricity. Funding has focused piecemeal on particular technologies with no coherent vision for the future system. This has meant emerging low carbon technologies like tidal energy and carbon capture have remained at prototype stages. And for stable supply, we do need adequate low carbon based load power, such as nuclear. A new nuclear can have a revolutionary role to play, combining electricity generation with the production of heat and low carbon hydrogen, a combined approach critical for supporting the broader decarbonisation agenda. Meeting our climate goals has to be about people. There has to be a plan for supporting the skilled workers in the existing energy sector, our members, into new roles in the low carbon economy. At the moment, low carbon means low pay, insecure and dangerous. A just transition with a central role for trade unions must be at the heart of our strategy. Carbon net zero needs to be achieved, but not on a foundation of our members' livelihoods and their lives. The balance of approaches set out in this motion can be worked out as policy is developed. But if the trade union movement is to have a credible voice on the single biggest threat facing our planet, then Congress, we must give the TUC a mandate going into COP26. Voting against this composite is a vote to leave our motion with no voice. The TUC would have no Congress policy on the climate crisis. That would be a betrayal of our members. Please support Composite 2.
Thank you, Neil. If I can call our Deputy General Secretary, please.
Well, thank you, President. As you say, the General Council supports the composite motion with a short explanation. 2021 is a vital year for action for the UK hosting COP26, and the General Council is united in a long-standing commitment to a just transition, to defending workers' rights and jobs, and to take urgent action informed by science to achieve net zero. That means prioritising, wherever possible, the retooling and adaptation of our higher carbon and energy-intensive industries. We do not want net zero to be achieved on the back of deindustrialisation. The composite specifically references domestic heating, and there are a number of forthcoming government policy processes on this and related issues, including the net zero strategy and the heat and building strategy, with important consequences for how we heat our homes, manufacturing, transport, energy and other sectors which will be decarbonised. And the TUC will be working closely with our affiliates, in particular those unions with members in those industries, as we engage in those consultations in line with the TUC's existing policy to support a balanced energy mix. The TUC will also actively campaign for government to retool existing industries, not just protecting, but growing the UK's manufacturing base. Now, the composite also introduces a proposal for a UK carbon border tariff. A carbon border tariff can play an important role in protecting domestic jobs and reducing global emissions as we decarbonise. However, a carbon border tax should not inadvertently undermine UK industry. And again, the TUC will engage with our affiliates to explore proposals for a carbon border tariff that doesn't have a detrimental impact on jobs. And with that explanation, President, the General Council supports the motion.
Thank you very much. So we've got 6 other speakers listed. So first up is Dean Cox from Community. Dean, you're welcome.
Thank you. Congress, Dean Cox, Community Trade Union, supporting composite number 2 on the climate emergency, defending jobs and just transition. Climate change is perhaps the greatest challenge we face as a planet. Record temperatures and extreme weather conditions are being recorded on an increasingly frequent basis. Failing to act now is putting our planet and jobs across the country at risk. That is why we are bringing this motion to Congress to work together to achieve our net zero goals, tackle climate change and back our existing industries like steel to decarbonise in a just way. We know that our steel industry must decarbonise and recognise that the future of the British steelmaking is supporting green jobs at one of the core of the low carbon economy. The green industries of the future, like offshore wind and electric vehicles, all require a reliable source of domestically produced steel. If we are serious about reducing global emissions, we cannot continue to import from other sides of the world. Congress, the choice is clear. Either we make the steel here, supporting tens of thousands of good jobs, or we can offshore those jobs and rely on high carbon imports from countries playing by different rules. Let's face it, they do not play by our rules. Steel jobs are good. They're unionised jobs. They're jobs that pay well, above the average for the nation of the area, and they support families and communities as they do so. That is why net zero means we need to grow Britain's steel industry, not shrink it, and in doing so, create new jobs and opportunities in parts of the country that most need them. We want to see a just transition where jobs are retained and where the change workers are supported and retrained. A just transition for steel is the only viable option our members and for our planet. But of course, future-proofing the steel industry requires thinking about how we make our steel. Neither employers nor the government can abdicate this responsibility. On this, they need to come to the table ready to make the investment that the steel industry needs. And our commitment to decarbonising the steel industry has the potential to create jobs and protect communities and help save our planet. We bring the motion to Congress to get the full powerful backing of our movement behind this. It is adequately clear that we cannot afford any further delay. Congress, please support this motion.
Thank you, Delegate. Next up is Bernard Kennedy from ASLEF. Bernard.
Thank you, President. Bernard Kennedy, ASLEF from Bristol branch. Congress, we all know that the climate emergency is the biggest crisis facing us for a generation, as has been previously stated. If we don't act now, the consequences will be far-reaching and irreversible. A crisis this big requires big and varied solutions. This composite motion covers several of the different elements of what we call just transition. It's all about ensuring that we approach this problem from many angles at once to have maximum impact. It's vital that we take a broad approach that will include a general industrial strategy and a fair and just transition with workers and trade unionists at its heart. One of the best levers governments have at their disposal is public procurement. Organisations from the NHS to local councils buy goods and services every day. Congress, we should be pursuing a procurement policy at every level which values British manufacturing, high environmental standards and shorter supply chains. I've worked in the rail industry for almost 42 years, having worked for British Rail and subsequently in the private sector. Much of that work experience involved driving all kinds of freight trains, so I know how efficiently rail can move goods around the country. We saw in the pandemic the vital importance of our freight network. The operators, industry and drivers, my colleagues, stepped up. Timetables were increased, trains lengthened, and we made sure that medical supplies, food and other important goods got to where they needed to go. More needs to be done, though, on the logistics side of rail freight in terms of connectivity. Many new warehouses are built without any rail connection. This would be federal law in countries like Germany and Europe. Unbelievably, some warehouses have even been built on sites of older rail connected facilities, and the rail connection has been ripped out. Rail freight already has a very low carbon emissions, and if the government invests in full electrification of the railway, it will be close to zero. Rail freight is a vital part of the integrated network to deliver goods right across the country, including to construction sites and right to the centre of urban areas. A just transition, though, means more than just using the right kind of transport and procurement. People must be at the heart. A government genuinely committed to tackling climate change would value the contribution of every worker in every community across our country. It would be working to ensure that high quality jobs fit for the future are created right across the UK. Whether that's in a sustainable transport, new energy industries, UK-based manufacturing, or any other growth areas, we need to fight the climate crisis. A true industrial strategy would be prioritising those opportunities. Congress, it's time for workers and trade unionists to take the lead, from fighting for sustainability in our workplaces to lobbying governments to take action. The time is now. Please join the fight for a just transition. Please support this composite. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Bernard. Our next speaker, I can call Steve Turner from Unite. You're welcome, Steve. I'm afraid it's the first time I'm going to have to say this. You're on mute, Steve. So.
Is that better, Gail? Can you hear me? I'm going to say yes, unless I'm interrupted again. Okay, thanks very much for that, Gail. Steve Turner, Unite, speaking in support of Composite 2. Colleagues, the Composite speaks for itself, and nobody in this virtual world, at least, is going to disagree with the scale of the challenges ahead. Climate change is not somebody else's problem. It's not just an issue for the global south or island communities drowning as sea levels rise. It's a class issue. It's a global crisis, and one that's here right now here in the UK. And it's a crisis that demands urgent action to clean up and decarbonise our towns and our cities, our skies and our sea, as well as the air we breathe, the products we use and the food that we eat. Action to protect our communities from pollution and growing threats of flooding, fire and drought. Conference securing a sustainable, healthy living environment for future generations is the challenge of our lifetime. And we're all going to be impacted by climate change, but no union will be impacted like Unite. We are the economy. We have been and we will continue to be centre stage in demanding that workers transition to a greener economy. And we'll be led by our members in the oil and gas fields, refining and distribution operations, in energy generation, construction and manufacturing, our members in the steel plants and those transitioning our automotive and our aerospace sectors, looking after our health and driving our buses or working in our aviation sector. Building the industrial organisation alongside the alliances with our communities, campaigning groups and wider civil society that are necessary to force through that political change. In the absence of any government strategy, Unite's developed its own. Our Manufacturing Matters strategy lays out a clear programme for change, from corporate governance, collective workers' rights and industrial policy, to the public procurement, investment, intervention and support necessary to transition and rebuild while we bring home our supply chains. An industrial and social plan to end austerity and invest in 1 million public sector jobs, caring for our sick, educating our kids, rebuilding our communities. A plan that builds the green new homes that we desperately need to end the housing crisis while decarbonising the rest of our housing stock, and investing in a balanced energy policy, including new tidal, wind, solar and nuclear generation. A plan to produce green hydrogen and biomass that we need to power that change. And of course, manufacturing the products that we need to do that here in the UK. Making those products locally, offering apprenticeships to our young, reskilling the existing workforce, protecting pay and standards of living, giving working people the confidence to come with us on this journey. Conference as a movement, we have to be confident in our ability to win a Green New Deal that protects our members and our planet, to shape the future of work and to ensure that no worker, family or community is left behind on our journey to a greener, cleaner world. And this composite lays out a strategy to win, an action plan that brings people with us, sets our TUC agenda for COP26. Nobody else will do this for us. So solidarity, comrades, support Composite 2.
Thank you very much, Steve. Our next speaker is Tony Kearns from the CWU. Tony, you're welcome.
President Conference, Tony Kearns, Communication Workers Union, to oppose Composite 2. And when the Composite opens up with the words, the climate emergency is the greatest threat currently facing humanity, Unfairness says, tackling global warming requires a coordinated international response. We don't disagree. Don't disagree that it's the job of Kevin and Neil and those unions to defend their members' jobs in those industries as they currently stand. And all of what Steve said about the urgent need to tackle this issue of climate change, we don't disagree with, except, of course, the detail about what is required and what this motion asks us to support is not the answer. Let's just take the call at E for the construction of new nuclear plants. What we're talking about here, we need to be honest, what we're talking about is, the average time it takes to build a new nuclear plant, given the target emissions for 2030, the average time it takes to build a new nuclear plant is about 14 and a half years. Yeah? From plant to operation is somewhere between 10 and 19, 14 and a half years on average, at a cost of about 22 billion. To build utility scale solar wind farms takes about 2 to 5 years. To build solar panel rooftop on an industrial scale take about 6 months. So the money and the time and the investment needs to be focused on those. And what this motion says about a just transition, you keep hearing this phrase, a just transition. And everyone supports it and everyone agrees with it. And it's a statement that everyone thinks they can sign up to, except what is in this motion is not a transition, is it? What is in this motion is more of the same. Because also at E, we also were told to use the existing gas supplies, which is one of the worst, if you like, fossil fuels that we currently use. So we're not transitioning away from anything. What we're embedding there is the current infrastructure. What we're embedding there is the current approach to dealing with energy. It does not deliver the alternatives that are needed. It does not set them up. You see, and it's also not true to say that voting against this leaves us with nothing. The trade union movement, individual unions and the TUC has a large number of long-standing policies on this particular issue. So voting against this does not leave us with nothing. Voting against this allows us to work with those groups that Steve Turner referred to that are desperately concerned about the plight of everybody in the world and the current disasters that are going to face us, environmental disasters. And this motion, while setting out at the very beginning, the challenge that faces us doesn't deliver. And it's for those reasons that the CWU opposes.
Thank you very much, Delegate. Our next speaker is John Maloney from PCS. John, you're very welcome.
Thank you, President. Like the last speaker, the PCS is asking Congress to oppose a motion. We do so reluctantly because there's many good elements in the motion. So we agree with the central theme of the motion that workers and unions must be at the heart of the fight for climate justice of the decision-making process as we move from a high carbon to zero carbon society. This will mean, at least to us, that the climate change must be an issue of economic and social justice as well as survival. For workers to ensure that they don't pay for the climate crisis through loss of jobs or livelihoods, for high carbon communities not to suffer the fate of the mining communities, for the steel industry not to go the way of the mining industry, and support for the global south who are on the front line of climate change impacts. In summary, those who have done least to cause the crisis shouldn't pay for the crisis. Now, for PCS, this has always been clear that any transition also has to be transformative. That is more than just arguing for green jobs in the same neoliberal economy that has been driving down wages and attacking pensions, creating precarious work, outsourcing and privatizing public services. It means arguing for a pro-public approach and public ownership of the energy industry, the water industry, the transport industry, etc. Now, we think those views are wholly compatible with what's being proposed in the motion and indeed are inherent in the motion. So we support virtually everything in the motion, but as always, there is a but. We don't think, for instance, blue hydrogen is low carbon, and so supporting blue hydrogen would be problematic for us. But fundamentally, we're opposed in principle to the construction of new nuclear plants. Indeed, we're opposed to the generation of electricity through nuclear fission. The arguments against nuclear power are well known: safety concerns, the long-lasting nuclear waste produced by fission, waste for which there is no sound plan or a plan to contain and to store, waste that will be enormously added to when plants are decommissioned with the associated colossal cost of doing so. The fact that the nuclear generated electricity is much more expensive, taking into account all associated costs compared to that produced by renewable sources, a cost differential which will widen in the future. But as Tony said, leaving aside all those arguments, the fact is going down the route of building more nuclear plants is a diversion. The monies, expertise, skilled labour needed to build new plants will be better used to begin insulating homes in the here and now, insulating buildings in the here and now, retrofitting new boilers, accelerating the drive to renewables, modernising the grid and electrifying the entire electric system, entire railway system. This Congress clearly recognises climate change is a fact and that global temperatures are rising and will rise. The only argument is by how much and what can be done to limit those rises. So we need action now, not waiting 10, 11, 14, 15 years for more nuclear power plants.
Delegate, I'm afraid you've gone quite a bit over your time, so I need you to wind up, please, because we need to bring other speakers in this afternoon.
Of course, just really to finish up then saying that we reluctantly oppose the motion and we ask Congress to do the same.
Thank you, delegates. And just to remind people that supporting speakers have 3 minutes. So our next speaker is Vicky Blake from the UCU.
Thank you, President. Vicky Blake, UCU President. We recognise the need for good energy jobs, but we must act ambitiously to prevent this whole debate becoming moot. We must not let events overtake us. UCU has long established policy opposing nuclear power and the extraction of fossil fuels, including gas. Nuclear technology is fundamentally unsafe, costly, and cannot mitigate against greenhouse gas emissions. Its irreversible effects on the environment condemn our descendants for generations to come to dealing with the storage and management of its waste and all the associated risks. We are committed to pressuring the government to take strong action against climate change and to support an end to fossil fuel extraction. We urgently need a just transition to a zero carbon economy with the full involvement and heft of the trade union movement. The composite motion notes the costs of renewable energy subsidies is rising, but costs and subsidies to nuclear energy are rising too, at pace. We need serious government investment in genuinely renewable energy and the creation of millions of green jobs with proper investment in accessible, comprehensive education and training programs for a just transition that does not just reproduce old hierarchies, exclusions, and inequality. We need to ensure the unionisation of the millions of green jobs so urgently needed. No worker should be left behind, and the destination must be a future that is fair and sustainable for all. So at this critical point in the climate crisis, we cannot afford half measures, and we cannot rely on polluting or unproven technologies. Starkly, to avoid the scale of disasters we already see around the world hurtling even faster towards us, we need a fuller and faster transition to a just economy and a just world. We need the movement to share an ambitious vision of a sustainable, safe and just future and to push with all we have for the financial, social and educational investment this necessitates. And we do have existing environmental and climate Congress policy. Our motion at this conference, number 11, highlights the unequal distribution of consequences of climate change and the inequalities inherent in how our economy is currently structured. We are indeed at a crossroads for energy, but this composite motion will commit us to supporting a dangerously inadequate staging post fraught with risk of huge proportions and irreversible effects on the environment. Instead, we must fight harder together for investment in research and the development of new technologies alongside fundamental shifts in education for sustainable development, freely accessible to everyone to make sure no worker, present or future, is left behind. Our leadership at this Trade Union Congress should inspire the UK and go beyond our borders, developing solutions that will help and inspire the whole world. Thank you. I ask you to vote against this composite.
Thank you very much indeed, Delegate. So I'm going to call Kevin Buchanan from the GMB, who has the right to reply to the debate. Kevin, you're welcome.
Thank you, President. Kevin Buchanan, GMB, exercising the right of reply. I want to respond to some of the points made during this important debate. I mean, on the earlier question, one of the colleagues suggested, you know, the use of solar power as a replacement for nuclear. And I have to say, I mean, sitting here in Glasgow, it raises quite to suggest that solar power would be able to replace what is provided by a nuclear industry is quite not very credible at all. And in the same breath, the criticism of hydrogen gas as a replacement for North Sea gas is, which is a far more better environmental alternative. I think the argument's there for itself. But I want to concentrate obviously on nuclear, because there were a number of arguments around the nuclear power. And we all bring our own mandates to this conference. And I understand the arguments that were made, but I have to ask you to consider this. We're not talking about hoped for jobs at some point in the future. We're talking about tens of thousands of good unionised jobs that will be lost if our ageing fleet is not replaced. The jobs crisis is upon us now. And we've heard delegates attest, jobs are already under threat due to the uncertainty. I ask you, what do we stand for if it's not the defence of our members' jobs? And yes, adapting to a climate change emergency to make those jobs fit for tomorrow. It was said that nuclear requires heavy subsidies, but according to International Energy Association, the whole life costs of nuclear are competitive with renewables. It was also mentioned about safety concerns, but again, the actual safety numbers are comparable with renewables across the world. And the UK has the oldest and best developed safety culture. It is our members who work night and day to deliver a safe, dependable supply. And it was mentioned what nuclear delivers is the security of supply, complementing renewables and the flexibility currently provided by gas. Congress, let there be no mistake. If there is no nuclear replacement programme, then tens of thousands of jobs will be lost. If this Congress today votes to abandon these workers, then I'm in no doubt it will cause the GMB to reflect on the consequences of that decision and how we best defend our members and our future in this Congress. We support a just transition, but nuclear is part of a decarbonised future, and there is no justice in a transition from skilled to the unemployment lines. We cannot promise replacement jobs that we do not know we can deliver. We should not call for investment instead in sectors where manufacturing jobs are offshored. This is about the right choices for the country and about industrial solidarity. Stand with us as we would stand with you. Congress, please support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So thanks to all the speakers. Unison, RMT and TSSA have also indicated opposition to the composite motion but do not wish to speak. And FDA, who are party to the composite, have indicated support but do not wish to speak. Congress, as there is opposition, I will move to a vote. Sort of listen carefully. General Secretaries and their delegation leaders have been sent an email from Civica Election Services with a link to a voting site. Please follow the link to the site, where it's important you select online formal vote number 1 for the vote on Composite 2. That's online formal vote number 1 for the vote on Composite 2. You will be asked if you're voting for or against the Composite motion. Your vote will be weighted according to membership in the same way that card votes are weighted. The opportunity to vote starts now, and you will have 10 minutes to complete it. Delegation leaders have been told who to contact in the case of a problem with the voting link. Congress, we'd normally pause whilst a vote takes place, but as we're doing this electronically, I will continue with the business and I'll announce the result of the vote later in the session. And before calling Composite Motion 3, I've got a Zoom instructions message here. Please, could I ask all speakers to have their own name displayed on their Zoom so we're able to find them when they join, and if you can't do that, find a 5-year-old, they'll help. Congress, I now call Composite Motion 3, Rail Cuts, Climate Change and a Post-Pandemic Recovery. The General Council support the Composite motion. The motion will be moved by Louise Atkinson from ASLEF and then seconded by Sarah Jane McDonough from TSSA. Leslie, you're very well.
Very well. Good afternoon, Congress. Louise Atkinson-Smith, moving Composite 3, Rail Cuts, Climate Change and a Post-Pandemic Recovery. Over the last 18 months, the world has had to deal with a once-in-a-century event, a pandemic that has led to over 4.5 million deaths worldwide and caused a health and financial crisis for hundreds of millions of people. We all hope, though we must never take it for granted, that we are through the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we must not allow ourselves to forget we are still in an increasingly urgent and deadly climate crisis. Lots of things in our world have stopped due to COVID-19. Climate change, sadly, is not one of them. Congress, we know that the pandemic has had huge financial implications for working people and the UK as a whole. The cost to the UK will be in the hundreds of billions of pounds. But as we learned the hard way following the 2008 financial crisis, you cannot cut your way out of national debt. We need to invest to grow our economy. Austerity is a political decision, and it's one that fails by all measures. So Congress, as we face two of the biggest questions of our times, how do we recover from the pandemic and cut carbon emissions? The answer is clear. Invest in green infrastructure. Now is not the time to cut, now is the time to rebuild. Our railway has been affected hugely by the pandemic. Many people who normally commuted were asked to work from home where they could, and lockdown killed off leisure travel. Our railway became a tool for transporting fellow key workers and essential goods around the country. I am proud that ASLEF members did their bit to help make sure the country could get through such difficult times. But following the support our industry got over the past 18 months from the government, they are now looking to claw back the cost. The intention is to cut £2 billion from the cost of our industry with possible job losses of up to 10,000. Services, of course, will be cut and reliability will be compromised. Whilst the future of how we work remains up in the air, before the pandemic, our railway was already at overcapacity. Over time, and we hope it's sooner rather than later, numbers will return. People will want to travel, and when they do, we have to be able to offer them the greenest form of public transport to help us achieve our carbon emission targets. If the train is not available, people will use their cars or aeroplanes. We cannot allow them to be forced into that decision. And it's not just passengers. We must invest and support our rail freight industry, which results in an average 76% lower emissions than that of the equivalent road journey. Congress, I can tell you that it's very quick and very easy to cut rail capacity, yet it's extremely difficult and extremely expensive to rebuild it. We cannot mothball parts of our network, which will play such an important role in our future recovery and be an essential tool in our fight against climate change. Not only this, but it also makes no economic sense. Rail infrastructure has one of the biggest multipliers of any investment. So Congress, As the government plans to mask huge cuts under their restructuring of the railway, we must remain vocal. We must grow our economy out of debt. We must build our railway up, not contract it down. And we must campaign to get people and goods on our railway to support our efforts to cut carbon emission. Congress, I move.
Thank you very much indeed, Leslie. I'm going to call Sarah J. McDonough from the TSSA to second.
Good afternoon, President. Good afternoon, Congress. Sarah J. McDonough, TSSA, seconding Composite 3. Brothers and sisters, the last 150 years of human activity, mostly in industrialised countries, has added a huge amount of harmful gas to the Earth's atmosphere. We know what the consequences of this are. We are seeing those consequences already in floods, fires, and extreme weather events globally. Our children are taught about climate change in school. Reminders to recycle are all around us. We as individuals are asked to live as sustainable a life as possible. However, the working class have already made a huge contribution in the fight against climate change. The poorest in our society do not make the choice not to fly. They simply cannot afford to. They do not buy new clothes unnecessarily because they have no spare income to do so. They aren't wasting energy because they can't even afford to heat their homes. When it comes to job opportunities or the chance to visit family and friends in other parts of the country, or perhaps a weekend away with the kids, we should all have the opportunity of an affordable railway system to take us there. This opportunity is taken away because it is completely unaffordable to the poorest in society. So many people are forced onto the roads when they could be using a low carbon alternative. The working class do not have a choice, but the Tories do. Rail is the lowest contributor to transport climate emissions. It accounts for only 1.4% of total UK carbon emissions, and yet Boris Johnson and his government have made the choice to cut £2 billion from the rail industry. The Tories have exploited the COVID pandemic to attack jobs in our industry and cut services for passengers. This government has the choice to invest in a transport system which could see people in this country having a better choice of jobs if they could afford to travel outside of their area. They could ensure that our domestic travel industry is boosted after the pandemic. And Congress, they have the opportunity to secure jobs for the key workers in the rail industry who kept this country moving during the pandemic. Instead, we hear that their solution is to cut back on support and cut back on jobs in the rail industry. The IPCC report in September told us that we have to act now, far quicker than previously anticipated. Let's not let this argument be dominated by the rich. Boris Johnson and billionaires like Bezos and Bill Gates spout their nonsense about unproven techno fixes, carbon trading and greenwash. Let the unions be central in enforcing real change for climate justice. The workers on the ground who are doing the jobs day in and day out know what needs to happen. Congress, let's fight for a people's railway, climate justice and the 21st century infrastructure we need. This composite motion demands that we campaign for more rail investment, not cuts, that we draw attention to the government's inconsistencies on rail and climate change, and that we must centre investment in low carbon transport to ensure a future green economy. Congress, we need urgent and radical plans to decarbonise together with a just transition. A Green New Deal cannot wait any longer. Please support this motion.
Thank you very much to both Leslie and Sarah. We have no opposition, so the composite motion is carried. We now move to the section of the General Council report on creative industries. I call paragraph 2.9 and composite motion 5, support for the cultural sector. The General Council support the composite motion. The motion will be moved by Linda Rook from Equity and then seconded by Horace Trubridge from the Musicians Union. Linda, you're very welcome.
Congress, Linda Rook, Equity. During the pandemic, the role of the creative industries came into full focus, whether it was TV, film, audio, or live stream performances. The cultural sector helped us through because those stories highlight the human experience. They educate and they entertain. But the creative industries are also an economic powerhouse. In 2019, they contributed 112 billion to the UK economy. And within that, the cultural sector contributed just over 32 billion. But sadly, that success story is not always reflected in how many of our workers are paid or treated. In 2019, I was part of a working party drawing up Performance for All. It's a policy manifesto for an inclusive and a just creative sector. Things needed to change. Workers were tired of a continual battle to survive in the industry, and many didn't. The continuing struggle to find work, low wages, long hours, discrimination and harassment. Forget the often glamorous image of the red carpet arts. That is for the rarefied few. So, when the pandemic struck, what was a precarious industry for many turned into a nightmare scenario. Theatres shut, and for a while, film and television production halted. And you remember the number of repeats on our screens, some from the last century. And as our output stopped and our demand rocketed. I saw myself on some of those repeats, and I remember thinking, good grief, is that me? But at the same time, the portfolio careers of many of our members who work in hospitality, leisure and retail stopped overnight. Many were not able to access the self-employed income support due to eligibility criteria, and they fell through the cracks. 40% of our members missed out, mostly new entrants or young members and PAYE freelancers. Well, we're updating this document to account for the impact of the pandemic and to include some of the startling statistics that are coming out, one of which is that 44% of Black women are leaving the industry, and that figure is from the Office of National Statistics. Having started to get a toehold in the industry, many Black women feel it's not for them, as do many disadvantaged groups who are experiencing similar challenges. So, things have got to change. And we're calling for a basic income guarantee for creative workers. It's been endorsed in the Republic of Ireland, where it kept up to 50,000 arts workers out of precarity and poverty. And in Wales, Scotland, and numerous local authorities in England, there is the appetite to look further at the concept of universal basic income and universal basic services, which will provide a new and effective safety net for artists. Up to 1 in 5 of our members are now universal credit claimants, following the failure of SICE to provide proper help during the pandemic. And they're about to be pummeled again. Universal Credit is actively working against self-employed creatives through the reimposition of their minimum income floor and the removal of the £20 uplift. But we also need to open up the industry so that if you're brought up in South Shields, Kilmarnock, Cumbrawn, Omagh, Redditch, Morecambe or Minehead, there is the opportunity to work in the cultural sector. We need to regionalise and democratise the whole of the creative industries, from the BBC to regional arts councils, to achieve a real and meaningful levelling up across the country, to create decent union jobs throughout the nations and the regions, and to devolve decision-making to local communities and workers to ensure the best use of funding and real inclusiveness. And finally, we would like to thank the TUC for their solidarity in campaigning for a duty on employers to prevent workplace harassment, which has led the government to announce they'll look into this and able to consult further on extending the time for all Equality Act-related employment tribunal applications. And we still need to make sure that self-employed workers are fully covered in the implementation of both these policies. And we need to push the government hard to urgently extend the ET limits, well, to at least 6 months. At the moment, there is a big discrepancy between employment-based claim limits and the 6-year limit for civil harassment claims. Thank you, Congress. Please support the composite motion 5.
Thank you very much indeed, Linda. And if I can call Horace at Trowbridge from the Musicians Union to second.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, Congress. The MU are very happy to second this very important composite. I'm not going to repeat the figures and statistics listed in the composite. Suffice to say that this is an industry that is invaluable to the economy and also employs hundreds of thousands of people. So it's a vital industry. What I want to do in the 3 minutes allotted is to give you a very brief history of the unfairness of the record industry, which applies directly to our call for equitable remuneration on streaming. If you go back 50 or 60 years, performers were generally treated very badly in the contracts that they signed. There's a wonderful saying in the music industry, which is that the large text giveth while the small text taketh away. And that was very much the case with record contracts in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. And then, of course, the record industry suffered the rigors of piracy, which meant that the labels who were used to absolutely lining their pockets from the profits that they make from all these talented people suddenly found that they didn't have those profits anymore. And then along came streaming. And unfortunately, the record companies applied the same kind of contracts that they used for physical product to streaming. So in other words, they didn't have to manufacture product anymore. They didn't have to store it. They didn't have to distribute it. They didn't have any of those costs. And yet they still treated performers as if they did have those costs. Things are slowly changing, but we need a bigger change. We need the right to making available, which is an exclusive right. And I'm not going to get too technical, but that is the right that performers give in order for the record companies to exploit their recordings on streaming platforms. We need that right to also include a right to equitable remuneration. Equitable remuneration works very well in the UK. It's how performers are rewarded when their recordings are broadcast or played in public premises. And session musicians receive equitable remuneration, but session musicians get nothing from streaming apart from the original session fee that they were paid. So with the help of the report that's come out of the DCMS Select Committee and a private members bill that Kevin Brennan is pushing through in December, we are hopeful that we can change the industry and make sure performers are properly rewarded. At the moment, labels are getting sometimes 6 times, even more times as much money from the use of a recording on a streaming platform than the performer who made it is getting. And this has to be changed. Please, Congress, support this motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Horace. We have 4 speakers in this debate. First up is Vicky Johnson from the FDA. Vicky, you're welcome.
Thank you. President, Congress, Vicky Johnson, FDA. I'm speaking to you from Dublin. Why am I telling you that? Well, because it's embracing remote and hybrid working, something that the pandemic has brought into sharp focus for most of us, but not for our colleagues who work in national museums and art galleries. These colleagues cannot work remotely. They have to travel, they have to attend particular buildings, often old, drafty, and badly maintained buildings. And bizarrely, these buildings contain some of the UK's national and greatest treasures. Now, we can access these treasures for free, but it seems the government appears to think that because we can access them for free, they don't need to provide the cultural sector with proper funding or a proper structure. It chooses to spend millions providing state-of-the-art office accommodation that we can no longer fully use and no longer actually need to, because 18 months working from home has proved that. Contrast this with the decline in funding provided for our colleagues in the cultural sector, the lack of a proper structure in that sector, and the resistance to assisting them through the pandemic. And you can see a sector that is facing crisis. The activities at art galleries and museums and the very ability to view these national treasures contributes greatly to the economic, cultural, and latterly the mental health of this country. When these institutions were forced to close completely, the extra source of income so carefully developed in the form of their retail outlets and their specially curated exhibitions ceased. And since reopening, it has remained small because visitor numbers are restricted and unlikely to return to pre-pandemic levels for some years. Indeed, many of our colleagues have been unable to return to the sector, having instead to seek other employment, because when finally agreed to, the furlough funding was inadequate. And the effect on the sector is stark. I was lucky enough to visit Hampton Court twice, once in 2019 and once in 2020. In 2019, the gardens were awesome, particularly the rose and the kitchen garden. In 2020, it was heartbreaking to see them virtually a wilderness. And that is just one small part of the cultural sector, the history of our country. The sector is poorly paid, recruitment is often through short-term contracts, so you can't build a career in the sector. The pay freeze is being implemented, but it's being implemented on a pay already frozen by 2020, so it's a real-time pay cut. The diversity of the sector is impacted. So to protect our colleagues and to protect our cultural history, to protect the national treasures and our ability to learn from our history and to view those treasures, we ask for immediate no strings attached financial support, a real-time or real terms increase in the grant in aid for the sector, and better pay. Please support Composite 5. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vicky. Our next speaker is Lorraine Monk from the AEU. Lorraine, you're welcome.
President, conference, speaking from the Artists Union. Both our motions to conference form part of Composite 5. The first called for a commitment from government to expand investment in arts and culture. The second calling for a trial of UBI for creative workers. The creative sector, already at risk from years of precarious employment, cuts to existing cultural provision and exploitative labour practices, was under stress before the pandemic hit. The creative industries make a huge contribution to both the economy and well-being, entertainment and joy, challenging our opinions even while entertaining us, and, for the Tories that might be listening, contributing a whopping 112 billion in taxes in 2018. We're calling for a greater investment in the arts, 1% of GDP, up from the 0.6%, because it represents good value and good investment. The other motion we had was on universal benefit income, a cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or requirement to work. Proposals for a basic income date back to Tom Paine. A form of UBI was proposed as an alternative to the Beveridge report. An interest in UBI has now returned in response to globalisation and automation in the workplace, threatening the livelihood of millions of workers. As COVID-19 shut down the economy, the UK government was forced to pour billions of pounds into supporting jobs and services. All their schemes were conditional, not all workers benefited, and they're all due to end. The inadequate response from the Tory government raises the opportunity for the trade union movement to consider radical future options for both work and entitlements, and that includes UBI. The Irish government recently confirmed its plans for a trial of UBI for artists, and we call on the TUC to support an introduction of a UBI trial for creative practitioners. Too many talented people are forced to abandon working in their creative field because they cannot afford to carry on. 83% of artists earn less than 10k per year from their practice, and 20% have 3 or more jobs to support themselves. The jobs are part-time, 0-hour or short-time contracts. During COVID, many artists experienced a double loss of freelance income and wages as creative opportunities disappeared and whole sectors closed. Creativity is an attribute unique to human beings, and developing our artistic talents should never be a luxury only the privileged few can access. We need art for everybody. We need art practitioners from every sector. Please support this motion and Composite. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Next is Martin Kavanagh from PCS. You're welcome, Martin. I'm afraid Martin was on mute.
Okay, now Gail. I'll go just and interrupt me again if you can't hear me. President Congress, Martin Kavanagh, speaking on behalf of PCS, in support of Composite 5, by highlighting the amendments that our union submitted to the original motion 22. Congress, COVID pandemic has exposed how precariously millions in our society in this country live and work. The safety net that once supported people through the ups and downs of life has been decimated by this and previous governments. Over £30 billion has been cut from the social security system in a little over a decade. And the pandemic has meant that more and more people than ever have had to rely on a social security system, many for the first time, that despite the hard work of our members in DWP, simply isn't fit for purpose. This dire situation that we find ourselves in calls for radical policy, and UBI undoubtedly falls into that category. but we do have, as a union, concerns about UBI. And our amendment makes clear that while we welcome radical solutions to address the grotesque levels of poverty and inequality, much more work needs to be done on UBI and its potential impact on members and the wider communities. Not all economists and academics are in agreement that UBI will be good for workers. As trade unionists, we have a vital role in assessing the risks that UBI could pose to our members and the public. Public Service International, a global trade union federation representing over 20 million workers in 163 countries, have confirmed in their view that the UBI poses a danger that would entrench low pay and insecure work. And PCS also shares concerns of others about the impact UBI could have on bargaining power of unions and undermine workers' power in their place of work. One version of UBI in Scotland, modelled by the Institute of Social and Economic Research, found it was unlikely to achieve wider goals of significantly reducing job insecurity and allowing more people to choose whether to care, train, or hold out for better jobs. For trade unions to sleepwalk into this position would potentially be disastrous for our members. Disabled people and campaign groups have also highlighted the potential negative consequences of basic income, specifically in that income would not necessarily be able to cover the costs for those who live with disability. Therefore, our view is that a system of disability benefits would still be needed to run alongside UBI, and the details of how this could work should be top consideration for all policymakers and campaigners. My union PCS represents around 50,000 workers in DWP, members who are frontline delivering social security policy, and we've long advocated for a radical reform of that social security system. It's our view that that system is the best tool for lifting the most vulnerable in society out of poverty. Many of the stated aims of UBI can be achieved through radical reform, which takes into account modern living and working habits. In the same way the Beveridge Report transformed Britain after the Second World War, a Beveridge Report for the 21st century can pave the way for the recovery from the COVID pandemic and beyond. We're concerned that the introduction of basic income will weaken the demand for this much needed reform, and if left on the wrong hands, could be a Trojan horse for even deeper cuts to welfare state. The pandemic has presented us with huge difficulty and complex challenges that require bold and radical solutions. And while PCS support this composite, we also fully believe that the approach, for the sake of all of our members and the most vulnerable people in society, we have to look at all policy implications. They must be carefully examined and considered before committing ourselves. Please support Composite 5.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. And the last speaker in this debate is Christine Danielle from Prospect. Christine, you're most welcome.
Good afternoon, President and Conference. I'm Christine Danielle from Prospect, speaking in support of the composite motion on support for the cultural sector. Our members in the cultural sector have suffered and continue to suffer from low pay. Research shows that those working in this sector are often paid less than the living wage. Low pay rates at Museum of London resulted in strike action in 2019, something we may very well see a return of given imposed pay restraints. A more recent example is Royal Museum Greenwich. Up till today, it does not pay staff the London living wage, despite being situated in one of the most expensive boroughs, something Prospect has repeatedly called out to be addressed. Low pay rates are being further impacted by the government's pay pools imposed in this year's pay remit. This cuts across the freedoms these institutions are supposed to have. Even where institutions have the funds to afford pay increases, they're being prevented from doing so. This leaves low-paid staff facing a pay freeze this year again. Today, we support the call for increased funding in order to meet minimum standards of pay. In addition to the issue of low pay, I'd like to highlight how restructuring impacts the funding model for museums. At the Victorian and Albert Museum, there has been a significant restructuring programme in order to make ongoing savings of £10 million. This is as a result of long-term financial issues and reduced visitor incomes exacerbated by the pandemic. This has resulted in the loss of around 150 jobs and the equivalent loss of 1,000 years of specialist knowledge. Individuals are facing job cuts. They face real danger of losing their homes, struggling to find food for themselves and their dependents. This can affect their mental and physical health and their families. Access is being limited as the museums has moved from a 7-day to a 5-day opening. This is simply another cost-saving measure where we all lose out. Museums have to make significant cuts. It also means that they miss out on exploring new projects and they're unable to take creative risk, retain and pay staff a decent living wage. We welcome steps by campaigners and unions to support and lobby for increased funding so those working in the sector can earn a decent living. Please support this composite. Thank you, conference.
Thank you very much, Christine, and to all speakers in that debate. As there is no opposition, the composite motion is carried. Delegates, we now turn to section 4 of the General Council report, the sections on health and social care. I call paragraphs 4.1, 4.3, 4.4, and now composite motion 12, invest in public services. The General Council support the composite motion. The motion will be moved by Andrea Egan from Unison and then seconded by Amanda Burley from the GMB. Andrea, you're very welcome now to move, please.
Thank you, President Congress. Andrea Egan, Vice President of Unison, moving on behalf of Unison Composite 12, invest in public services. Congress, working people have been through the mill over the last 18 months. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected everybody to varying degrees. Our public services and union members have kept the country afloat. So now is the time to invest in them properly and to reject the failed policies of the past. Austerity has never worked before, and it certainly won't work now. What we need is proper investment that will rebuild our crucial services and put them on a sure footing for the future. Unfortunately, the government seem to have a very different view. Any hopes that emergency financial support during COVID would continue beyond the immediate peak of the pandemic have been dashed. Indeed, we're back to the same old Tories, cutting first and asking questions later. The spending constraints will not help the economy bounce back. Instead, they will cut off a recovery before it has even taken hold. And this will lead to yet more misery for our hard-pressed public service workers. Unison recently carried out freedom of information research in local government. It showed that councils in England, Wales and Scotland are struggling. They have landed with huge budget deficits of almost £3 billion for the next financial year. Emergency extra funding is desperately needed in local government. Otherwise, the alternative is more cuts, cuts and cuts. And this will be on top of the devastating cuts to services councils have already suffered. Whether we're talking about bin collections, teaching assistant numbers, social care, library hours or access to parks and green spaces, the impact is also being felt in the pockets of public service workers. We've already had a decade of wage restraint in the shape of pay freezes and pay caps, and this seems set to continue in one form or another for the foreseeable future. Emergency extra funding is desperately needed in local government. Otherwise, the alternative is further cuts. This affects virtually every sector in Unison and which Unison organises in. In local government, despite all the courage and sacrifice throughout the pandemic, council and school workers have been offered 1.75%. With inflation of 3.8%, that amounts to a real-term pay cut. The health and care sector face particular challenges compounded by low pay and requiring urgent reforms. Our members must not pay for the financial COVID crisis. Co-workers, refuge collectors, social workers, teaching assistants, street cleaners, and many more have gone above and beyond during the pandemic, keeping communities safe, caring for the most vulnerable, and ensuring schools remained open throughout successive lockdowns. People who went out to work so that others could stay at home, rewarded with a pay cut. And we've seen this in all unison sectors: higher education, the Environmental Agency, and police staff. Many of our unions in Congress are at various stages of consulting on pay offers or building support for action on pay. What we need is a real alternative to cuts and austerity. This has to be based on long-term investment, like backlogs in the NHS, and dealing with long COVID and how this will affect people in general and people in their workplaces. Secondly, pay is crucial. We have to ensure a decent reward for those who have pulled our public services through the pandemic, and this means an immediate end to the damaging pay freeze. More than this, we need to ensure that the future is one based on fairness. We have to address the inequalities exposed by the pandemic, the disproportionate impact it's had on Black workers, on disabled members and women. And finally, we need to make sure that the post-pandemic economy is much more sustainable than the current one that we have, that we prioritise a greener future, one with public services at its heart. Congress, I move.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Can I call Amanda Burley from the GMB to second, please? Amanda, you're welcome.
Thank you. President, Conference. Amanda Burley, seconding Composite 12, Invest in Public Services on behalf of GMB and a proud frontline worker in our social care sector. Congress, public services are part of the fabric which holds our society together. They belong to us, formed from generations of struggle by working people for a better society which holds the well-being of all at its heart. From cradle to grave and all the moments in between, we rely on these public services which are founded on those values, our values. Thousands of our members have put their own lives on the line as key workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. For doing so, they were applauded by politicians in power, but now are being left unrecognised, disrespected and unrewarded. The pandemic tore apart any pretence that we have a fair and safe social care system, not for service users and not for the workers. The average care worker in England was paid just £8.50 an hour last year. That's 41 pence more in real terms than the hourly wage 7.5 years ago. Years of outsourcing and underfunding has left our social care system in pieces. A third of care workers are now on 0-hour contracts, rising to half in London. And as GMB research shows, 1 in 10 care workers are in receipt of in-work benefits. It should be a source of national shame that the dedicated care workers who kept our most vulnerable alive during the pandemic are paid so badly that they are on universal credit. Our care sector is already facing up to 170,000 vacancies by the end of the year, and a mandatory vaccine that could force thousands more away. With the government's plan to slash universal credit payments by £20 a week in October, we are heading for a perfect storm. GMB is campaigning for £15 an hour minimum for care workers. It is the least that they deserve, because any credible plan for the future of social care must give proper pay, terms and conditions to the staff doing the work. But instead of real investment to tackle the huge crisis in social care, the sector has been left with just £500 million for directly addressing workforce needs under the government's new health and care levy. Conference. This crisis was not caused by public sector workers. It was caused by the failed ideology of successive governments that know the price of everything but the value in nothing. But our members know their worth. £15 an hour is not a lofty aspiration, it's pay justice. It will bring care workers' earnings in line with the average for workers across the whole economy and gives them the reward and recognition they deserve. And it should come alongside urgent reform to end exploitation in care and to provide high quality services fit for the future. Conference, a fight for 15 is a fight for us, our loved ones, and for those who care for them. Please support this motion. I second.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I call Jill Taylor from the CSP.
President, Congress, Jill Taylor from the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy, and as always, proud to come to Congress representing healthcare workers. Every day, physiotherapists and physiotherapy support staff work with their patients to transform their lives and the lives of their carers for the better. This year, I am all the prouder. During their response to COVID, CSP members saved lives and provided outstanding physical care and emotional support to those whose lives they couldn't save. Our members rapidly had to acquire new knowledge and skills. They were redeployed to new work areas and repeatedly put their patients ahead of their own families and loved ones. But they did so with a health service that was struggling to cope, a health service that was already on its knees following a decade of austerity. Staff were forced to confront the fact that sometimes they were unable to give the best possible care to each and every patient in need due to the lack of resources. Our patients, your members, too often went without desperately needed care and rehabilitation. Tensions boiled over, and health and social care staff have faced unprecedented levels of abuse as they went about their work, and this is certainly not over. The last 18 months has placed an unsustainable strain on an already overstretched health and social care staff. The latest NHS staff survey indicates alarming rates of burnout. Many, in particular older workers, are considering leaving health and care services after a lifetime of public service. Congress, despite the pandemic, these issues are not new. Neither are the solutions. What is needed now is investment in our health services, investment in our equipment, and investment in our buildings. And we need to invest in more NHS staff and in proper pay, rewards and support to keep those that we have. Congress, we must redouble our efforts to ensure equitable access to properly resourced public services, to secure decent employment and living wages for all, and to bring health inequalities to an end for good. Congress, please support this composite motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Jill. Next up is John Skews from the RCM. John, you're very welcome. John, I'm afraid you're on mute. I won't confirm when you switch off, so if I don't interrupt, just press on, please. John, I'm afraid we can't hear you. So there is either a problem. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go, well, let's see if we can get you on.
Again, Chair, that looks better. John Skews, Royal College of Midwives, supporting the composite. Congress, midwives and maternity support workers are on their knees. They are burnt out. The Delta variant is now hitting unvaccinated pregnant women hard. COVID in its multiple waves has hit the NHS, social care, education, public services and key workers too. Years of Conservative underinvestment left our members to cope, poorly equipped and understaffed. They bore the years of standstill pay, short staffing and long shifts with fortitude. They did their best to cope with growing demand and then the pandemic. We have warned for 10 years that midwives and other health workers, patients would snap. They gave so much during the pandemic, their own health, mental and physical. They delivered the vaccine alongside science and volunteers. They kept frightened service users safe. They provided the care. Last year, our members told us by 8 out of 10 that they did not believe their trust had enough staff to provide safe services. 7 out of 10 said they were considering leaving the service. Nearly 4 out of them really seriously, 4 out of 10 really seriously considering that. I say that not to wave shrouds. I don't do that. The RCM doesn't do that. It's happening now. Last month, the exodus started. We lost 300 midwives in England alone when the numbers should be climbing. Now our members look at the 3% settlement and say, sorry, that doesn't value me. Yes, they're angry, but they need more people on shift, they need a break, and they need more than warm words. A catastrophic health pandemic saw them do their duty, as did all public servants and key workers. There needs to be a better day for staff of all of our public services, not one that robs them to pay for more of the same, as we saw with the announcement on the increase on national insurance, which incidentally also robs the services they work in as well. They need fair investment in pay, in staff, to provide services, in infrastructure, in flexible working, and in pensions, and that's absolutely clear. We need post-pandemic a vision of a better future, not a Boris bitter future. We need funding and fairness, and that needs to come from those most able to pay. But it needs to address the priority needs of the many. Without that, our public services, health, care, education, and the rest are lost. In 20 years, I want our kids to say they coped and we regained what we are proudest of in our public services, not they coped until they couldn't. Support the composite.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Our next speaker is Annette Mansell-Green from the BDA. Annette.
Oh, thank you very much, Gail. Annette Mansell-Green, BDA, supporting Composite 12 and delighted to do so. We're hearing from the different representatives of professions within the public services about the underfunding and lack of commitment by the Tory government and the staff who deliver them, who are being undervalued and under-rewarded, but it is worth repeating some of these arguments as they're vitally important. Congress, there's never been a time when our NHS workers have been in such sharp public focus. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the skill, compassion, versatility and commitment of everyone involved in the delivery of care to patients, whether that's the receptionist, the doctor, the nurse, the physiotherapist, the radiographer, the podiatrist, or indeed the dietitian. Too many of these extraordinary people are broken by the severe impact of the last 18 months. And as we've heard, they're exhausted, traumatized, and now struggling with their own mental and physical health. And let's not forget that our NHS staff were already feeling the pressure of consistent understaffing, with vacancy rates running at above 100,000 well before 2020. And this, coupled with low pay, is leaving them feeling demoralised and undervalued. 1,500 health and care staff have died during the pandemic, and the government should recognise that they will be held accountable for their actions in, for example, leaving many resorting to using bin bags for PPE. Pay is a significant and immediate issue. In real terms, adjusted for inflation, average NHS pay remains below where it was in 2010 at 5% less than a decade ago. And Congress, it's disgraceful that 4 in 10 NHS workers are in receipt of a state benefit. Is this how those who save our lives should be rewarded? A publicly owned and properly funded NHS, free at the point of delivery, should be the shining light of a civilised society, one which we should be proud of and which we must guard with our lives. And it should never be a feeding ground for capitalist so-called friends of the government, as some aspects of it have become, particularly during the recent pandemic. Meaningful and sustained public investment is urgently required to ensure the future of our NHS and the incredible staff who provide such dedicated and skilled services to patients. This investment should come from those who can afford to pay for it, the highest earners, the wealth holders, the tax avoiders, not the workers themselves, and certainly not working pensioners through an unfair hike in national insurance contributions. So finally, we're calling for investment in staffing, better access to flexible working, less reliance on expensive bank and agency staff, Staff need to have protected time to recover from the mental and physical effects of the pandemic, and importantly, a meaningful and sustainable pay rise to address the years of shortfall. Only then can we really say that our NHS team is truly valued. Thank you, President. Thank you, Congress.
Thank you, Annette. So if I can call Amit Molde from the FBU. I'm afraid, Amit, you're on mute. If you can just turn your sound on, please.
Yeah. President, Congress, the FBU echoes the sentiment of previous speakers and adds our thanks to everyone in the sector, public and private, who worked tirelessly through the pandemic, just as firefighters did, to ensure all vital services continued operating for our communities. We're on the cusp of a critical stage, the post-pandemic recovery, and we must ensure that the government hears us. Do not use the pandemic as an excuse for more austerity, more cuts, and more pay freezes. The public sector has already faced savage cuts, thanks to the current Westminster government and its predecessors. Prior to the pandemic, we lived through a decade of austerity, so we know already through experience that the justification for cuts or underinvestment have centered around flawed interpretations of data designed to manipulate headlines and therefore public sentiment. After cutting budgets to the bone, key services were already overrun, with little contingency built into place in case we were blindsided by a pandemic. We will not survive another shock. Parts of the public sector have faced 30 to 40% in real-term cuts over the past decade, and this has led to a cut in the workforce. Public sector workers have suffered real-term pay cuts of at least 10%, in some cases double that over the last decade too. In our case, 1 in 5 firefighter jobs, which is more than 11,000 firefighters, have been cut, with the most brutal cuts coming from the incumbent Prime Minister during his tenure as London Mayor for a laughable 7 pence per resident per week saving. And this was against a 93% opposition at public consultation. We know that the money is there in the economy, but the appetite to fund public services and tax the elite and wealthy, which is synonymous with donors and lobbyists, is just not there. Rather, the focus has been to depress wages from those who can ill afford it and slash key services for all, including the most vulnerable who rely critically upon them. Congress, we have to demand investment in public services. We have to stand up for our members and our communities who rely on public services. Support the composite. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amit. Our final speaker in this debate is Martin Furlong from the RCOP, podiatrists. Martin, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Gail. President Congress, Martin Furlong from the Royal College of Podiatry, speaking in support of Composite 12 on investing in public services. Congress, in our evidence to the NHS pay review body earlier this year, we highlighted how staff in the NHS live in and contribute to every community in the UK. From porters to podiatrists, managers to nurses, physios to dietitians, logistics specialists to electricians and beyond, there are many professions, specialists and skilled staff who all together make up one NHS team. And the same can be said of the rest of the public sector, as Andrew from Unison so eloquently pointed out. We also argued in our evidence that by investing in decent pay for our members, that government would actually be investing in these communities where our members live and work. By investing in public sector pay, the private sector benefits too, from spending on local transport in the hospitality sector and with the other providers. Good public sector pay is good for all. Many of our members reported that they have received little or no increases in pay for 10 years due to the austerity programme of the government, and this cannot continue. The recent pay rise in the NHS was nothing more than a sticking plaster on a large, deep wound, and the pay freeze across the public sector, a shocking lack of investment. We also highlighted how investment in the NHS generally is needed For example, our members do a great deal of work around preventing serious illnesses and amputations. This helps to keep people economically active and contributing to society. The preventative work that the NHS does is chronically underfunded, and the longer-term costs far outweigh the investment needed now. However, we also want to highlight burnout and the support needed. In our evidence of the House of Commons Health and Safety Social Care Committee report that's referred to in the composite, we reported how stress levels in the NHS were so high that many of our members wanted to leave. There are already large numbers of vacancies in the NHS, and if staff continue to leave, then we'll be facing an even bigger crisis. It is important that we invest in supporting all our members in the NHS and the rest of the public sector, public service, to ensure that they have the right support and a fair level of pay. Invest in the NHS staff, and it will continue working in its professions that they love and will keep our society healthy. Please support the composite. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and to all speakers in that debate. As there's no opposition, the composite motion is carried. Thank you very much.
Congress, it's now my pleasure to invite our President to address us.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue. It's my pleasure to start by thanking, as President, TUC staff for their support and their work throughout another challenging year. And also to thank my union, Unite, for all the opportunities and support given to me as an activist and then as an official. A union isn't an inanimate object. It's a living, evolving force for change. As someone once said, there's power in the union, and it's great to be a part of it. So let's take heart that union membership has grown for the 4th year in a row. That's cause for celebration. Our focus is to do even more to build membership and organisation. During my year as president, we have seen 2 women earn their place as leaders of our 2 biggest unions. Christine McAnee, Unison's first woman elected as General Secretary by a union with a majority of women members, representing workers at the forefront for providing essential services throughout the pandemic. Yet for many, their women's work is still undervalued and low paid. Christina is dedicated to changing that, and I'm proud to have her as a sister and a friend. And my friend Sharon Graham, my goodness, an organiser and negotiator of extraordinary ability, winning campaigns that others said could not be won. Quite rightly, Sharon points out there's a library of policies highlighting inequalities women face at work, and she has pledged to bring to the bargaining table our demands for action. 20 years ago, my union held a girls' lobby of the CBI. Our daughters demanded equal pay in our lifetime. My daughter was 8. Eleni is now 28. The fact that in 2021, women effectively work the first 64 days of the year for free makes my blood boil. So let's take inspiration from the women's suffrage movement. Now is the time for deeds, not words. And let's be clear, a public sector pay freeze and an offer to the NHS that falls far short of what they need and deserve is picking the pockets of the majority female workforce who stood between us and despair when we needed them most. A shameful affront which says so much about Tory values. During the pandemic, many have seen the disproportionate impact of lockdown on carers, mostly women. Now, a brief look at our history shows this juggling of care, of work, and of activism isn't new. 34 brothers founded the TUC in 1868. 75 years later, in 1943, the TUC elected their first woman's president, Anne Lachlan. When Anne was 12, her mother died. She cared for her 4 sisters. She was 16 when her father died and became the family breadwinner. working for threepence an hour in a Leeds clothing factory. Aged 21, she took up as an organiser for the Tailor and Garment Workers Union, and the following year she led a strike of 6,000 clothing workers in Hebden Bridge and became her union's General Secretary in 1948. Anne was one of only 6 women TUC presidents up until the year 2000. The millennium has evened things out. However, when I'm asked, does having women in the leadership of a union make a difference, I say, damn right it does. Alongside the 13 unions now led by women, we also celebrate the women who lead the TUC, the Wales TUC, Scottish TUC, Irish Congress and International TUC, and of course our own TUC. Remember, sisters, the words of the African-American civil rights activist Angela Davis. Sisters in leadership, lift as you rise. The TUC report that emerged from our Disabled Workers Committee on sexual harassment showed disabled women face an appalling level of workplace abuse that must be resisted and reversed, alongside our movement calling out the increase in hate crime against our LGBT plus members. And here I'd just like to show my appreciation to Patrick Roach for his leadership of the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force. As Patrick will tell us later in Congress, the case for radical change is overwhelming. We know collective solutions and actions safeguard the rights of individual workers, and unions are beginning to make inroads into the gig economy. Well done, GMB, in winning recognition and a fair deal for Uber drivers. And over the year, our movement has again proven we are a force for good. The TUC and our affiliates work to support our incredible vaccination programme, delivered not by the private sector, but by our wonderful NHS. Vaccines developed by our brilliant scientists and academics, many of them Prospect and UCU members, and administered by our members in the NHS. Combined, our unions represent the UK's biggest democratic mass movement. We are a movement of and for working people. And it was union health and safety reps who knuckled down safeguarding workers at the height of the pandemic. They fought to ensure workers had the correct PPE, negotiated COVID-secure work practices, and exposed negligent employers. We owe them so much. And all our reps, hundreds of thousands of workers doing extraordinary things, representing their colleagues, winning decent pay and conditions, fighting for equality, and helping workers access life-changing learning opportunities. Their efforts mean unionised workers earn more, are paid more equally, have more access to training, are more likely to have better pensions and holidays, and are safer at work. As the world changes, so must trade unionism. So we look, sound and feel more like the workers we aspire to represent. Our challenge is to rebuild our values of equality, solidarity and collectivism, at the same time as making sure we remain relevant in the world of Netflix, WhatsApp and Spotify and goodness only knows what else, in an age when decisions, choices and communications happen in the blink of an eye. We must liberate the potential of 21st century technology, exploring new gateways into trade unionism, new models of membership and new ways to organise and bargain. This is especially relevant to our young members and the mass of young workers not yet signed up. And we're an international movement. Those of us supporting the struggle against apartheid remember and repeat today the South African workers' slogan, "An injury to one is an injury to all." The far right's ruthless targeting of women's abortion rights in Poland, Texas and elsewhere goes hand in hand with what the UN calls the shadow pandemic, the upsurge in violence against women and girls. TUC Aid helped fund the Building and Woodworkers International programme of training to tackle violence against women and girls, training that reached thousands of workers across Latin America and the Caribbean, and that's solidarity in action. We have also seen far-right authoritarian regimes using the COVID crisis to crack down further on workers' rights, whether it's in Hungary, Brazil or India. We must continue to build solidarity with our sisters and brothers facing brutal violence in Colombia. Over 100 activists have been killed this year so far, and we stand with those facing arrest and repression in Turkey, as we stand in solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Palestine. We repeat our demands for an end to the injustice and an end to the brutal and illegal occupation. Saying these words takes me back to meeting the Colombian trade union leader Carmen Mayusa in Bogota Women's Prison. We campaigned and she was released. Then her brother's butchered body was delivered to her family home. And of the Palestinian children, Congress, I met in refugee camps and villages in the West Bank and Gaza during the First Intifada, whose artworks invariably showed violence against their families and the destruction of their homes. When we speak of solidarity, we must remember that each and every one of us is a trade unionist, and every one of us struggle is one of us, and that solidarity is two ways. We stand together. Our fight for economic, social and racial justice and peace extends beyond national borders. Decent work for all must be at the heart of a new global economy. Our history tells us the best way to improve pay for all workers is to raise standards through strong unions and collective bargaining. We can look back proudly at historic victories such as the chainmakers of Cradley Heath, the so-called match girls of London's East End, and the Ford sewing machinists in Dagenham and their sisters in Halewood. Yet in so doing, it is our collective responsibility to win for workers here and now, tomorrow, and in the decades ahead. Solidarity to you all, here and globally. Have a good Congress, and remember, above all, actions speak louder than words. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. And I now call on Sharon Graham to move the vote of thanks to the President.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Gail. Chair Congress, Sharon Graham Unite, moving the vote of thanks to TUC President Gail Cartmail. I am truly proud and privileged to move this vote of thanks to Gail, my colleague, my friend, and my trusted sister. We've led disputes together, we've been on demonstrations together, we've negotiated together, and of course, Gail, we've had a party or two together on many, many occasions. But don't worry, Gail, I won't be telling those stories here, not just yet. Gail is a hugely generous person and hugely generous with her time. She has been a constant source of encouragement and strength to me and many, many other women. In the recent Unite election, many people told us to stand down, said we couldn't win, said it would be impossible. And when you're in a place like that, you look to people, you turn around to see who is behind you, and when I did, there was Gail. She was the first one to contact and say you must stand. She didn't take the easy option. She never does. Through the difficult parts of a sometimes toxic period, Gail was a tower of strength. And without that strength, I wouldn't be here today as the first woman General Secretary of Unite. So thank you, Gail, and thank you for all you do. But that's what she does. She supports, she gives a helping hand, and quite simply, she is very, very kind. Like so many other women in our movement, Gail started her working life as a school leaver. She was just 15. She was employed as a hairdresser. I often smile when I think of this. I imagine the captured audience sitting in the chair, Gail with a pair of scissors, trying to persuade them to come behind one cause or another. Before long, Gail moved into the print industry, and this really is where she cut her teeth in the trade union movement. She was elected Mother of the Chapel in 1975, and that's when she began to defend workers. She was one of very few women in her workplace, and this really defined and shaped her. It made her very determined and extremely focused. Her experiences in those early years have stuck with her and guided her through her working life. In 1990, she founded Socialist Women on a Male platform to push out women's voices, to ensure women could be heard. She is constantly looking for ways to drive women forward. Gail is also a focused negotiator. When we first worked together, it was on leverage during the Besner construction dispute. And at that time, leverage was very new. And it would have been really easy for her to resist such a campaign that pushed boundaries and went against the usual playbook. But Gail understood leverage immediately. She championed it as another way to push back bad employers. Gail always shows a lot of courage and very little fear. Moving now away from the bargaining table and turning to conferences, in the evening, Gail and I would slip out of the crowd, get fish and chips, and have a glass of wine or two. Our conversations would literally last for hours. I have certainly learnt a lot from Gail. What a formidable woman. Gail absolutely believes in the power and the potential of trade unions, that we are a force for good, that we are the vanguard. We can deliver real change for the lives of working people. And for the future, Gail will be where she's always been, for the last 40 years, at the front of the fight, stopping workers paying for this pandemic, pushing back emboldened employers who think that they can get workers to pay for this crisis. Congress, we've only lent Gail to the TUC this past year, and I know what a proud moment it has been for her. As a 15-year-old woman leaving school, she never imagined that she would be president of the TUC. It was a moment we spoke about often, and Gail, that moment now is here. And it also has been a huge privilege for her union, Unite. Gail, we couldn't be more proud of you today. I know you will do an incredible job for the rest of the week. Congress, I am proud to move this vote of thanks to my friend, my comrade, and my sister, Gail Cartmail. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you so much. And I'm now really delighted to second the vote of thanks for my colleague and my friend, Gail. I'm also pleased to follow you, Sharon, as Unite's new General Secretary, and to take this opportunity to wish you every success in the important work that you have ahead. Congress, it's been an extraordinarily challenging year to be the TUC's president, and that is the case both professionally and personally for Gail, but she's done it with style. I'll say no more about this just now, but if you haven't already seen it, I'd recommend that you watch Gail's piece on YouTube, details of which have been circulated with the Congress update today. And if you're not moved, I'd be surprised. As Gail says in that piece, General Counsel and executive members have seen plenty of each other, albeit on screen over this period, including a few meetings that Gail chaired whilst with her family in Greece. And I have to say that Gail is always calm and inclusive in the chair, and that her usual assurance was hardly at all affected by being in a different time zone. Though there was just one occasion, and I don't even know if you're aware of this, Gail, when she inadvertently caused some confusion amongst the rest of us about whether the meeting was running to Eastern European or British summertime. Actually, I think we all just wish we were there in Greece with you at that meeting. Now, Gail and I joined the General Council at the same time back in 2005. We became founding members of the Union Learn Board, and I'd like to think we played a part in the great achievements of Union Learn, right up until this government spitefully withdrew funding from it. Gail is also the long-standing champion and chair of TUC Aid, another important TUC body focused completely on practical capacity building for trade unions internationally. And I know that Gail is particularly proud, and rightly so, of the recent project involving Building and Woodworkers International that she just spoke about. building trade union activism on violence against women in Brazil, Latin America and the Caribbean regions. Violence against women is an issue for all of us, everywhere. And closer to home, Gail stepped forward too to lead the TUC's work on how trade unions as employers deal with sexual harassment and, importantly, on preventative strategies. We all know in the wake of the Me Too movement that this is difficult and sensitive work, and especially so in democratic organisations. So all the more important that it is led wisely and well. Well, Gail's your woman for that. And I can say that not just in a personal capacity, but also on behalf of the TUC Women's Committee. Now, over the last year, I've had the opportunity to work particularly closely with Gail on industrial issues. And I do want to say how fantastic it is to work with somebody so honest, perceptive and organised as Gail, and who you know without doubt will have your back. Because Gail is a woman, a leader who lives her values, who has lifted as she's risen. I admire her for that, perhaps almost as much as I admire her ability for early morning outside cold water swimming through most seasons of the year, something I definitely cannot do. Now, it's a shame, Gail, you don't have the opportunity to preside over our traditional in-person Congress. But as we've seen already this afternoon, there's important business to be done, and I look forward to you leading us through it. Thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you very much indeed, Sharon. Thank you, Sue. I'm just going to have a look outside later and see if I can find the Gail that you're all talking about. And I remember former President Rita Donaghy, I think now in the House of Lords, saying at the very beginning of Congress, she's a blubberer. And as you can see, so am I. So I'm in good company. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. So we're going to move on with the business of Congress. Delegates, we turn to section 5 of the General Council report, Winning More for Workers, from page 54. I call paragraphs 5.1 to 5.4 and composite motion 16, increasing membership in the private sector and mobilising for a new deal for all workers. The General Council support the composite motion, moved by Dave Ward from CWU, seconded by Fiona Steele from Aegis. Dave, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Gail. Afternoon, Congress. Dave Ward, CWU, to move composite 16, winning for workers, and to say that I'm very proud that the CWU motion that's contained within this composite poses the single biggest question that all of us face as trade unions, as union reps, as members and as workers. And it's this: are we willing to up the ante? Are we willing to come together, harnessing the strengths of our movement, undoubted strengths of our movement? And are we willing to put together a serious plan to mobilise workers in a fight for a new deal for workers, our families and the country? And the motion that we're putting forward comes against a background like no other in the history of our movement. Years and years and decades of structural imbalance of power and wealth in the world of work, in the economy, heightened by an experience that none of us ever thought that we would have to live through with this COVID pandemic. Surely this is the moment where we must stand together. The CWU motion puts forward the plan. We are open to you guys sharing that plan, building on that plan, but we need to do something together. The motion starts by saying that the TUC already existing New Deal Charter needs to be sharpened with a contemporary narrative that reflects the drastic challenges that we must now overcome in this country. And It talks about agreeing a shared set of industrial and political demands. But crucially, our plan of mobilisation makes it possible for each union to put forward and pitch their own particular key struggles with their own members, but then connect it to that wider plan. It calls for a national rally, all of us getting back out on the street in spring 2022. But what's different is that we want to start that work now. We're calling for town hall style meetings to take place up and down this country with union leaders, with representatives of communities coming together and sharing a platform so that we prepare for the biggest mobilisation of workers that we've seen in decades. It makes it clear that every single union branch, every single cross-union organisation like trades councils should have the New Deal campaign on their agenda. And it makes it clear that we are willing to build a social movement like nothing that's been seen in this country before to achieve serious change. The New Deal demands can end in-work poverty. It can end racial inequality. It can tackle all forms of inequality, and it can build the race to the top for all workers in this country. But we have to recognise one thing. We can't win unless we campaign and act together. The New Deal mobilisation plan calls for the General Council to agree the basis of that plan, publicise and communicate it by the end of October. And like many of you, I've lived and worked a life of fighting for all of our members, workers, fighting for social justice. And I'm not prepared any longer to sit back and watch a Tory government and Johnson destroy the lives of working people. I'm not prepared to see this world of creating division deliberately to stop us seriously levelling up and seriously levelling out power and wealth in this country. And let's be absolutely clear, the Labour Party are not going to deliver that for us. They've been disconnected to working people. But the trade union movement, whether you support Labour or not, and I do, we have to take the lead now. We have to come together. And if you vote for this motion, if you vote for this composite, then please make sure that you actually carry out the terms of this proposition. We are not going to accept any watering down of this policy. We're going to be out there working with you. And I know there is a spirit in our movement that can win for workers. The one thing that's missing is our ability to campaign and take action together. And that's what this motion delivers. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave. If I can call our seconder, please, Fiona Steele from Aegis. Fiona, you're very welcome. Fiona, I'm awfully sorry, you're on mute. You just need to turn your sound on, please.
Apologies. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you, President. Good afternoon, Congress. Fiona Steele, Aegis the Union, seconding Composite 16, increasing membership in the private sector and mobilising for a new deal for all workers. Congress, it's hugely inspiring to see trade union membership within the TUC increasing for the fourth year in a row. However, this is largely down to more workers in the public sector joining up. Recent figures show a significant fall of 110,000 members in the private sector, with coverage here at its lowest level since the aftermath of the financial crisis. Equally alarming is that only 10% of workers aged 16 to 24 in any sector of the UK are in a union. The list of issues impacting young workers in the private sector are well documented, so there are no shortage of campaign possibilities. With such low union density, it's no wonder these workers have fared so badly as a result of COVID. Now more than ever, they need a collective voice. Along with the many other challenges that we face, unions in the private sector in particular are seeing increased competition from disruptors, new organisations offering services traditionally provided by unions. They too offer workers access to support and advice at work, or to come together to campaign or self-organise through online platforms. Many are commercial organisations set up purely to make a profit. As millennials now make up more than half the workforce, their working lives have been dominated by the internet. They expect things to be immediate and always accessible, and this includes getting help and support in the workplace, often from these disruptors who do not share the values of our movement. I regularly talk to new starts in the finance sector about the importance of joining our union. The majority of them are under 25, and I'm shocked by how little they know about our movement and the benefits of belonging to it. So we need to educate them. We can't rely on them finding out from their parents. Thanks to the Thatcher government in the 80s, we have many young people entering the world of work today whose parents have never been in a trade union, so they know little or nothing about our values and achievements. We desperately need to recruit more young people in the private sector and to encourage and support them to be active. The pandemic's had an impact on our sector like every other. The majority of our members have been working from home for over a year, so this inevitably means we have to rethink how we operate to remain visible. Whilst Aegis as a union have embraced the opportunities the new world of work provides, we are very small with limited resources to fund and develop our digital capability ourselves. So we welcome the collaborative approach that the New Deal for Workers campaign provides and the support provided by the TUC and affiliates. We call for a digital education and marketing campaign specifically aimed at young workers in the private sector and a dedicated budget and resource to support and work with affiliates to help achieve increased membership in the private sector and to help build the next generation of activists to protect and promote workplace rights. Conference, please support this composite.
Thank you very much, Fiona. We have two other speakers in this debate, so I'll call Louise Atkinson from the NEU. Louise, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, President. I am extremely pleased to be speaking in support of this very important motion. I would like to begin by thanking the CWU for bringing this to conference. The New Deal for Workers campaign covers key fundamental principles that we all, as individual activists, as trade unions, and collectively as a powerful movement of workers are calling for. The motion lays out a clear strategy and clear actions in order to achieve the principles that every worker deserves. When we have 4 million key workers earning less than £10 an hour and a pay freeze for millions of underpaid and overworked public sector workers, along with the government pushing for an increase in national insurance, a new deal for workers is desperately needed. The COVID-19 crisis has shone a light on inequality at work, but it has also clearly demonstrated the importance of and the need for strong and active trade unions. We have been the first and the last line of defence for all working people. We have been visible, we've been relevant, and we've been effective. But we must now build on that. We must come together as a movement to get organised, to get active, and to grow. As the world of work changes, we as a movement have to change, and I think that we can all agree that. The trends relating to membership density in the private sector and the age profile of all current union members are not just a threat to all of our individual unions, but they are a threat to the strength of our movement. We at the NEU have recently experienced a huge growth in membership which bucks some of these trends. The majority of our new members are young workers, and as our rep density is increasing, we are seeing them also become more diverse and getting more active, organising with their colleagues and winning. But we need to get better at shouting about our successes and sharing good practice across the movement, such as the use of digital technology to organise workers and to have a presence in all workplaces. During this crisis, the trade union movement fought for the safety, pay and conditions, not just of our members, but for every working person and for society as a whole. Millions of workers were safer during the pandemic and millions were supported financially through the job retention scheme, thanks to trade unions and to the TUC. I have never been prouder to call myself a trade unionist, but now is the time to ensure that every worker can say that they are proud to be part of our movement. That is a challenge. It will take work and it will take effort and it will take time for us all to build union density at the workplace, to build the expectations of all workers, and to build a social movement working towards collective action, demanding a new deal for all. The National Education Union fully supports this composite motion, and we are looking forward to working with all of our sister unions in order to carry out the actions laid out in the motion and to win a very much needed new deal for all workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Louise. Our final speaker in this debate is Justine Mercer from the UCU. Justine, you're welcome.
Hi. So thanks very much. I am delighted to be able to speak to this motion and to UCU's amendment. We are asking for a joint approach to the public promotion of the New Deal campaign because securing the widest possible public support will give it the greatest chance of success. And I want to make 3 points in relation to the motion and the amendment. First, in relation to the section of the New Deal entitled Control over When You Work. We must continue to support the genuinely self-employed whilst also calling for a ban on 0-hour contracts. UCU believes that high quality education and fair working conditions depend on contracts that give staff stability and continuity of employment. Casualisation is bad for staff and bad for education, yet it's endemic in our colleges and universities. 46% of universities and 60% of colleges use 0-hour contracts to deliver teaching. And I doubt many students or their parents are aware of these figures because college principals and university chancellors keep them very hidden. We also support the part of the New Deal that sets an ambition for a 4-day week. We have a motion on this, a Composite 18 on Tuesday morning that our General Secretary will speak to in more detail. The second point I want to make is in relation to better pay and fairer pay. As many speakers have already referenced, the pay awards during the pandemic have been derisory in many sectors, and this continues many years of below inflation pay awards. In the further education sector, for example, pay has reduced by 30% in the last decade in real terms when compared to inflation, despite colleges recently being awarded an extra 4.7% in funding. We also know that employers are not funding decent pensions for everyone. In the university sector, the largest pension scheme, USS, is under attack yet again, and we're gearing up for another round of industrial action. Finally, in relation to safe, satisfying and dignified work, the New Deal calls for workplaces where risks to safety and health are removed or properly managed. You'll be aware of the campaign that UCU ran this time last year to try and persuade government ministers and university vice chancellors that the movement of thousands and thousands of students across the country was a recipe for disaster, given the COVID-19 transmission rates at that time. A safe working environment is the cornerstone of the movement. The president referenced the so-called match girls, the women workers at Bryant and May, as did Sally Hunt in her 2018 TUC speech. They went on strike to avoid the flossy jaw that rotted their mouths. More than 100 years later, workers are still having to fight for a safe working environment. Earlier this year, around 600 prison educators took strike action for the first time in their history against an employer who would not address the health and safety concerns of our members and of their learners in prison. Much of these struggles are hidden from the public by bosses who are skilled in PR and spin. This is why we're calling on all of the unions within the TUC to mount a coordinated campaign to ensure the New Deal has the widest possible support, not just within the trade union movement, but from the general public. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Justine. And to all speakers, as there's no opposition, the composite motion is carried. Congress, I'm really delighted to introduce Thea Lee to address Congress. Thea was named Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs at the US Department of Labour in May after a lifetime of advocating and fighting for working people. including for a long time at our sister organisation, the AFL-CIO. We've been inspired by a renewed focus on workers' rights and fair trade in the US since the election of President Joe Biden. So, as I've said, I'm delighted Thea has agreed to join us live from the US very, very early on a Sunday morning for her. Thea, you're very welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and it is my enormous pleasure to be with you today. I bring warm greetings from Labour Secretary Marty Walsh, who has deep family ties in Ireland and Britain, and he is definitely looking forward to a visit to the UK sometime in the near future. This is an extraordinary moment in history. The confluence of enormous global challenges and existential crises have shaken all of us. We've had a year and a half of trauma, loss, and isolation. And it is overlaid, as you all know, on racial tension and conflict, which is playing out around the world in national politics in ugly ways, especially in the United States. But the increasingly severe climate change and associated weather emergencies with unprecedented fires and storms, and all of that laid on top of the growing inequality of many decades of power being deliberately shifted to corporations and the wealthy, away from workers and unions, certainly in the United States, but around the world as well. So that foundation of inequality is what the pandemic came on top of. And then, of course, the pandemic laid bare the vulnerability, the inequity, especially on race and gender lines and geography lines that existed in our economies. And especially in the United States, also the shameful inadequacy of social protections, the healthcare, paid leave, unemployment insurance. So those were the lessons that we all were exposed to during the COVID. And it's a little bit of a cliche to say that crisis creates opportunity. And yet in this case, I think it is an enormous opportunity for the global labor movement. And we must not hesitate to leap in. I've been happy to sit in on a few minutes of your Congress and to hear the urgency and the passion that you all are speaking with. And it's something that I hear in the United States as well. But if we think about the lessons that we learned, the failure of the market in moments of crisis, the fact that the essential workers in this crisis were nurses and grocery store clerks and meat packers, not investment bankers. And third, that every society is only as safe as its most vulnerable members. So all of those pieces together create a moment of change, of possibility. And the Biden-Harris administration has charted out an ambitious, progressive, pro-worker agenda, and very much in line with what you all are talking about in terms of building dignity at work. And we see that in the personnel, the fact that I'm over at the Labor Department, but also we have union leaders and staff at the National Security Council, at the Office of Management and Budget, at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. We've never seen such a pro-worker administration in my lifetime, at least in the United States. And the goal, of course, is to ensure a robust and equitable recovery, but not just to reach our pre-pandemic economy and labor market, which frankly stunk. We didn't have a strong, healthy labor market before the pandemic. So that's why President Biden says we need to build back better. And, we're currently in a battle with Congress to see how much of this ambitious agenda will actually be put in place. We have the obstructionism of the Republican Party, and then frankly, the, recalcitrance of some key Democrats. But that battle is playing out. But I just have to say that the agenda that's been put forward, the infrastructure, trillions and trillions of dollars of infrastructure spending, but redefining infrastructure in a way that includes, of course, green jobs, but also President Biden will say it all the time, green union jobs, that we don't just want to have renewable energy, we want to make sure that those are good union jobs. And also expanding the definition of infrastructure to look at the care economy and how to professionalize and make sure there's better pay and the right to a union for care workers, so that it has the dual impact of, first of all, helping many women get back into the labor force easily, but also making sure that the people who are in those jobs, traditionally, disproportionately women migrant workers and people of color, that they have the chance to make those into better jobs. And so race and gender equity are at the centerpiece of everything that the Biden administration is talking about. So both making sure that women and people of color have access to the good jobs being created in construction and infrastructure, and then also, as I said, transforming the jobs where there is occupational segregation into better jobs. And unions are at the centerpiece. President Biden has put together a task force on worker organizing and empowerment. And we are contemplating the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which would be a major labor law reform in the United States, much overdue. And we are fighting for all those, and the administration is fighting hard. But one of the keys, and this is what I'm going to talk about, is the connection between domestic and international objectives. So this administration has talked about a foreign policy for the middle class and a worker-centered trade policy. Because the truth is, and this is something, as you said, that I've spent my career fighting for and working on, which is that even if our objectives are to protect the rights and the livelihoods of American workers, we can't do that job if we are embedded in a global economy where workers' rights are trampled on, where workers are routinely fired, beaten up, or even killed for trying to organize a union, where child labor and forced labor are rampant, where discrimination goes unchecked. And so what we're trying to do is to use the power of the US market, the consumer market, access to that market through our trade agreements, through our laws, to use the leverage, which is the access to the market and the trade agreements and the labor provisions that we have in place, the resources, the technical assistance that we can offer, and the voice of the US government to lift up and strengthen workers' rights around the world. And that is the job I've been given. I couldn't be more excited, more energized by this moment in time. I started my career 30 years ago as a trade economist at the Economic Policy Institute, working on NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization, trying to argue at that time that we needed enforceable worker rights provisions in every trade agreement. And at the time it was, it was treated like a kind of radical fringe nutball idea. And now it is really at the centerpiece of what we're doing. We have some of the principles, just briefly. I know you all have a lot of work to do. One is inclusion, that we want to see workers' voices on a level with business voices as we shape and negotiate and enforce trade deals. And the second piece, and this is really my job at the Labor Department now, is the proactive monitoring and enforcement of the labor provisions and trade agreements. We've actually been pretty successful over the years in starting to write these enforceable labor rights provisions into our trade agreements. And we've been strengthening them progressively over time. But there's never been a proactive enforcement of them in the US. It's always sort of waiting for the complaints to be filed and then acting. And so now what we're trying to do is to self-initiate cases. We have really interesting and groundbreaking provisions in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. We've just been implementing a couple of cases there where we've seen some really good results. I came back from Mexico City. I was there last week, meeting with the labor secretary and looking at some of the great progress that they're making in terms of standing up a labor law reform in Mexico that is groundbreaking. It's also very ambitious and it's going to take a lot of work. But we are trying to be as supportive as we can in that process. But we also have very strong provisions in US law with forced labor. Since 1930, the US has in principle banned the import of goods made in whole or in part with forced labor. And yet we hadn't been able to enforce that until about 2016, when Congress strengthened that law and removed a loophole. So this is something that is a tremendously powerful tool right now, dealing with what we see in Xinjiang in China, for example, because so many key inputs and products are coming out of that and that are making their way through the supply chain, through the global supply chain. And what we want to do is to hold the corporations accountable and to hold governments accountable. And in our view, this is the strongest and the best way we can do it. And the last point I want to make is that all of this work is more effective when done in coordination with our international allies. And so, we look forward to working with all of you to carry out this important work and to make sure that your voices are added, that we can have as consistent and strong and powerful a message as possible about the importance of workers' rights throughout the global economy, that it is an essential piece of all the work that we do together. So thank you again for inviting me to be with you today. It is an enormous pleasure for me to be part of this Congress. Thank you.
And thank you so much there for joining us. And we really do look forward to working together in the future. Thank you so much. Congress, we now turn to section 5 of the General Council report, the section on global solidarity from page 63. I call paragraphs 5.7 to 5.9 and composite motion 17. Colombian government violence, justice for Colombia. The General Council support the composite motion. It will be moved by Joe Simpson from the POA and seconded by Sarah Woolley from the BFAWU. Joe, you're very welcome.
President, Congress, thank you very much. Joe Simpson from the POA. Absolutely proud to be moving this motion on behalf of the POA and also on behalf of my brothers and sisters in Colombia. Whilst we are right to debate the struggles that we're facing within our country, it's only right that we keep a collective eye around the world to the struggles of our brothers and sisters. Congress, Colombia is still the world's deadliest country for trade unionists, with the International Trade Union Confederation registering 22 murders between March 2020 and April 2021. There have been more killings since, such as teacher Carlos Freddy Londono on the 11th of August and Maria Lopez Cordon of Fensuagro, the agricultural union, on the 29th of August. Their names are added to the more than 3,200 trade unionists murdered in Colombia between 1971 and 2018. But although this is a historic crisis, no Colombian government has adequately responded to the violence carried out against workers who, like you and I, have committed no crime other than standing up for their rights. In fact, even as they're being killed, Colombian trade unionists face vile smears and attacks from influential far-right politicians with large followings. Trade unions have led the protests which began in April over inequality, human rights abuses and government attacks on a peace process. In the first 2 months of protests, security forces under President Duque committed massive abuses, killing at least 44 protesters, leaving more than 80 people with permanent eye injuries, and committing widespread sexual assaults and attacks on human rights defenders and journalists. They have also carried out mass arrests and violently assaulted thousands more. Trade unions and other strike organisers have called for an immediate end to the repression, police reform and negotiations to resolve the crisis, all of which the government has refused to agree to. With our trade union campaign, Justice for Colombia, the POA, with many other unions, have made our condemnation of this horrific violence loud and clear, and it is imperative that we continue to do so. The British government provides training to the Colombian police, and it has repeatedly refused to condition this support on human rights guarantees. That's not good enough. We need to keep our pressure up. Congress, in 2018, I visited Colombia with Justice for Colombia to see the situation facing trade unionists and activists with my own eyes, and was horrified at the stories of abuse they suffer. However, I also witnessed the incredible determination with which the Colombian people organize for fairer conditions and basic social rights in the face of brutal aggression. They deserve our full support. Congress, please support the composite. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. If I can call Sarah Woolley, please, to second.
Thank you. President Congress, Sarah Woolley, General Secretary of the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, as Joe said, very proudly seconding Composite 17. This November, Colombia will mark the 5th anniversary of the historic trade union-backed peace agreement. While there have been significant advances, the future of the peace process is under threat from the violence that is out of control and has seen over 1,000 community activists killed in less than 5 years. It also faces far-right political opposition, which seeks to prevent victims from attaining justice and to cover up the truth about what happened during decades of conflict. After the agreement was signed, more than 13,000 former combatants, around a third of whom are women, in the FARC guerrilla organisation began transitioning into civilian life. Many have developed sustainable livelihoods in diverse fields such as agriculture, ecotourism, medicine, journalism, and even beer brewing and fashion. The United Nations has repeatedly verified their commitment to the peace process. Their determination to build new lives and to fully participate in the truth and justice process must be commended. Unfortunately, they face extremely difficult challenges. By the end of August 2021, 285 former FARC combatants had been murdered and many others threatened, harassed, or driven from their homes. Hundreds of requests for protection measures have yet to be processed, whilst others have been denied, increasing their exposure to threats. Former FARC combatants also face alarming attacks on their legal security through false prosecutions that human rights groups are calling judicial setups. These intend to undermine the FARC's reintegration into civilian life and the peace process in general. Justice for Colombia plays a vital role in coordinating British and Irish trade unions' support for our Colombian trade union colleagues, as well as with human rights organisations, local communities and activists. My union is proud to support JFC's work, and we encourage all other unions to continue to support JFC at national, regional and branch levels. The peace process has rightly generated optimism that Colombians will one day live free from conflict and the gross social inequality that it fueled. However, ensuring the government meets its obligations to the peace process requires an international effort, including from the trade union movement. Please support this composite.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe and Sarah. As there's no opposition, quite rightly, this composite motion is carried. Congress, we've also had 3 motions submitted that unfortunately we've not had time to debate. So I'm now going to formally move these. I call motion 11, decarbonisation and decolonise in the fight for climate justice, submitted by UCU with an amendment from the NAS UWT. The General Council support the motion. As there is no opposition, the motion is carried. I call motion 60, health regulatory reform, submitted by the HCSA. The General Council support the motion. As there is no opposition, the motion is carried. Finally, I call motion 17, Palestine, submitted by the NEU with an amendment from TSSA. The General Council support the motion, and I call the General Secretary to explain the position.
Thank you, President. The General Council supports the motion, which is in line with long-standing policy to actively encourage affiliates, employers and pension funds to disinvest from and boycott the goods of companies who profit from illegal settlements, the occupation and the construction of the wall. The TUC supports efforts towards genuine peace, justice and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis with respect to the collective right to self-determination and the right to return, based on a 2-state solution. The General Council also notes that the crime of apartheid is increasingly discussed in respect of its definition under international law. The TUC's 2020 motion considered the term apartheid, and significant human rights organisations, including B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, now use the term. The TUC reiterates its support for an end to the arms trade with Israel, a ban on trade with the illegal settlements, and suspension of the UK-Israel Trade and Partnership Agreement until Palestinian rights are respected, and calls on the UK government to recognise the state of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. As there's no opposition, the motion is carried. Colleagues, I now have the results of the electronic vote for Composite Motion 2, the climate emergency, defending jobs and a just transition. The AUE and UCU's votes were cast after the deadline, but adding this to the certified vote, I can confirm that the vote is votes for the motion, 3,259,000. Votes against the motion, 1,950,000. The composite motion is therefore carried. A breakdown of the vote will be shared with leaders later today, sorry. Okay, so thanks everybody for that. So we're now going to hear from some more of our international friends with a message from the three leaders at TUC Brazil, one of our trade union sister centres, Sergio Nobre, the national president, Natalina Lourenco, the national anti-racism secretary, and Rosana Fernandes from the Anti-Racism Committee, and any mispronunciation was entirely my responsibility. Apologies for that. We now have the video.
Quero saudar os companheiros e companheiras do Trade Union Congress do Reino Unido. Quero aproveitar a oportunidade para agradecer enormemente o apoio internacional que temos recebido. Infelizmente, aqui no Brasil, hoje estamos vivendo o pior momento da história da classe trabalhadora brasileira. Em 2016, uma aliança de extrema-direita, partidos de direita, a mídia e parte do judiciário e o sistema financeiro deram um golpe que afastou a nossa presidenta Dilma. A partir de 2016, inaugurou-se no Brasil um enorme projeto de desmonte da legislação trabalhista, de ataque às instituições, em especial ao movimento sindical. Nesse momento, o governo de extrema-direita de Bolsonaro prepara um enorme desmonte do Estado brasileiro, privatizando as principais estatais brasileiras. Não só isso, Bolsonaro desmonta a legislação ambiental e o incêndio na Amazônia choca o mundo e também o desrespeito à demarcação das terras indígenas. O momento é muito grave. O desemprego e o desalento já atinge 1/3 da população brasileira.
Companheiras e companheiros da TUC, eu sou a Natalina Lourenco, sou secretária nacional de combate ao racismo da Central Única dos Trabalhadores da CUT Brasil. Eu estou passando aqui para parabenizá-los por mais um congresso, mas também para enaltecer a nossa parceria aqui de longa data e que vai se aprofundar cada vez mais. Muito importante essa parceria entre a TUC e a Central Única dos Trabalhadores no Brasil. Companheiras, esse não é um momento feliz para o povo brasileiro. Os povos originários estão sob ataque. A classe trabalhadora, principalmente as mulheres e as mulheres negras, também estão sob ataque de um governo genocida e ditador. Portanto, nós estamos em luta para defender não só a vida dos indígenas brasileiros, mas a vida da população brasileira e das mulheres.
Eu sou Rosana Fernandes, da Secretaria Nacional de Combate ao Racismo da CUT. A sociedade que nós queremos, a sociedade que nós lutamos, é uma sociedade onde as mulheres são respeitadas. A sociedade que a gente tanto sonha é uma sociedade onde homens e mulheres, negros e negras, têm os mesmos direitos e as mesmas oportunidades. E para a construção dessa sociedade é necessário que a gente desconstrua o governo Bolsonaro. Nós lutamos pelo fim do machismo, do patriarcado. Nós lutamos pelo fim do racismo. Não é possível construir uma sociedade democrática com esses pilares tão desiguais que, infelizmente, estão tão presentes na vida da gente.
E esse quadro tão perverso tem colocado a classe trabalhadora brasileira em luta. Todo mês há uma grande manifestação nacional pelo afastamento de Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro faz um governo criminoso e genocida. Infelizmente, no Brasil, estamos nos aproximando da trágica marca de mais de 600 mil mortos pela Covid-19. 70% dessas mortes poderiam ter sido evitadas se não fosse o comportamento negacionista e genocida do governo Bolsonaro. O ano que vem, vamos ter eleições presidenciais no nosso país. E nós temos a esperança de vencer as eleições, porque hoje o ex-presidente Lula lidera as pesquisas eleitorais com uma boa vantagem. Mas nós não temos ilusão. Bolsonaro, desesperado, ataca a democracia e ameaça a realização das eleições, questionando o nosso modelo eleitoral, que é um exemplo para o mundo. Por isso que o apoio internacional e o acompanhamento do processo eleitoral no Brasil é muito importante. E nós contamos com a solidariedade e o acompanhamento de vocês. Quero agradecer e estou muito honrado pelo convite que me fizeram. E desejo a todos e todas um grande congresso.
Well, colleagues, I'm sure you'll join me in sending our solidarity and support in their fight against Bolsonaro's far-right government. I don't know about, it's an honour for them to speak to us. I think it was an honour for us to hear our sisters and brothers. That completes our session for this afternoon, but there are still lots of online fringe events taking place which you can attend. All the details can be found on the TUC website. A record of all decisions taken during this year's Congress will also be available on the TUC's website. And we also have an online exhibition this year to give our usual exhibitors the opportunity to fundraise or to advertise their activities. And again, all the information is on the TU website. So thank you so much for joining us. Congress is adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow. You can join via the same link if you're watching the live stream. So have a good evening, everybody.